Good afternoon, and welcome to the Public Safety and Government Operations Committee meeting. In attendance today, we have, of course, myself, Chair of the Committee, representing the 4th District. Councilman Burnett is joining us virtually, representing the 8th District. Councilman Cohen, representing the 1st District. Councilman Costello will not make it today. Councilman Glover is running a little bit late. Councilwoman Porter, representing the 10th District, and Councilwoman Ramos, representing the 14th District. Representing the Office of the President, I've got Preston in the background. And representing the Mayor's Office, I've got Sophia G. This afternoon, the committee will have a hearing on legislative oversight, LO 21-0006, quarterly crime stats and violence prevention plan, for the purpose of the committee holding a hearing quarterly to review crime statistics for the police department and to monitor the progress of the biennial violence prevention plan. This bill was introduced on March 8, 2021, and it was sponsored by myself. Today we are actually using this legislative oversight to continue our series of monthly check-ins, both with the Baltimore City Police Department and the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. Today we are focusing primarily on the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood and Safety and Engagement to discuss two major strategies that they've been working to implement. One, that being the group violence reduction strategy, and the second being crime prevention through environmental design. These are two, I believe, very important solutions that are going to be key towards our ability to address violent crime in the city going forward. And I think even crime more broadly, certainly for crime prevention through environmental design. So eager to hear where we are with updates on both of these strategies. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Monty to get us started.
Thank you, Chairperson and members of the committee. If we could start the presentation. For the record, my name is Shantae Jackson. I am the Director of the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. The first portion of the presentation will focus on where we are with regard to the implementation of the group violence reduction strategy and some initial sharings around our thought about scaling up across the city. Next slide. Next slide. So for members of the public, it's important that folks know that there is an integrated gun violence prevention approach that the mayor is taking through the implementation of the Comprehensive Violence Prevention Plan, GVRS and CVI, respectively the Group Violence Reduction Strategy and the Community Violence Intervention work. Specifically focusing in on GVRS for the purpose of this hearing, we are currently piloting this strategy in the Western District and started that pilot back in January of this year. Under Mayor Scott's leadership, MONSE is responsible for driving that strategy and for the day-to-day project management associated with its work. We coordinate not only MONSE resources, but BPD resources, state's attorney resources. Both of those partners sit here with me today. Service providers and community moral voice partners. We are also partnering deeply with law enforcement, not just at the local level, but at the state level, including the AG's office, at the federal level, including the USAO's office, the FBI, DEA, and other partners. Also at the state level, we're partnering with the Department of Juvenile Services, with Parole and Probation, with DPSCS, and many others. This strategy is one that is completely meant to be integrated and complementary to our CVI approach. Next slide. So we're going to spend some time sharing with you information that demonstrates the key performance indicators that we have been capturing. GVRS stat is version 1 is out there and has been shared with members of this committee, I believe for the last 2 months now, given its publication in July or August. And we'll jump through some of those key statistics now. Next slide. And so as folks can see in taking a look at the Western District month-over-month comparisons, which really take a look at 2021 versus 2022, along the benchmarks of a 7-year average and also a 7-year average through 2022, we can see that we are seeing sustained declines in both homicides and non-fatal shootings in the Western District. And through October 31st, we are down 20% in October in homicides and 70% in non-fatal shootings in the Western District as a result of the implementation of this strategy. On an aggregated basis, that means that we're down roughly 30% in the Western District. Next slide. This is a summary of the analytics through 10/31 and speaks specifically to arrests, to the direct communications that we are doing for individuals, and to the services that have been offered and accepted. I won't spend a lot of time on this particular slide because the statting graphs go into a deeper level of detail. Next slide. This, in my opinion, is the graph that really drills home the point that the GVRS strategy is past the point of optimistically cautious about its success and us having demonstrated the proof of concept of this work. In taking a look at this graph, you see monthly homicide and non-fatal shooting numbers year over year with district level comparisons. The Western District, as you can see, in aggregate is down 30%. And it's worth noting because in doing the problem analysis around determining which district we were going to go into first, the Western District has been historically the most violent district in our city. That 5-year problem analysis, if folks recall, told us that 818 folks over a 5-year period had either been killed by a gun or a non-fatal shooting victim. And so to see such a dramatic change in what gun violence looks like in the city since this pilot began, I think is telling in itself. We can also see how it compares to the other districts here.
Director,
Yes.
Can you do me a favor and just give me a little bit of insight on what we're looking at here, because it's a little bit difficult to see?
Yes. So again, this is total monthly homicides and non-fatal shootings year over year, 2021 versus 2022. The bar to the left, or for folks who are looking at it online, the blue bar indicates the homicides and the non-fatal shootings for previous years. So those are 2021 numbers, and the bar on the green represents that same metric, but for this year.
And then for the bottom one as well.
Yes, the bottom box, so the Western District is the district that's listed at the very bottom, and you'll see that in green it says negative 30.3%, while obviously until we get to the point of having absolutely no shootings, we don't want these colors to be indicative of green light, red light, stop light, but is our attempt to demonstrate that we're trending in the right direction. So second, after the Western District, we've got the Central District being down 26.5%. But I think that what is worth pointing out here on this slide is when we go back to the problem analysis that we performed, the top 4 most violent districts were the Western District, the Eastern District, the Southern District, and the Southwestern District. And we are seeing nowhere near the gains that we are seeing in producing the reduction of gun violence when comparing the Western against those other 3 districts, those districts that are chronically violent. Sir, does that cover that slide for you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Next slide, please. This slide specifically speaks to the breakdown of services that we are providing to GVRS participants, and that is because this model is one that employs a balanced approach associated with a deep understanding that community moral voice also known as community violence intervention, is the utilization of credible messengers and service providers who are giving folks opportunities to step away from engaging in or potentially engaging in illegal activity. And so this graph shows you what the breakdown of those services are that have been provided to GVRS participants to date, with the lion's share of that at 30% really being deeply rooted in life coaching. And life coaching means that we have someone who has a dedicated relationship with an individual who's at the highest risk of being shot or being a shooter, and isn't just checking on that person to make sure that they aren't being shot or shooting someone else once a week or twice a week, but anywhere from 1 to 5 to 10 times a day, depending on what's going on with that person. Next slide. This next slide is a breakdown of the financial assistance that is being provided to GVRS participants, and is broken down into 3 categories, specifically around relocation and housing assistance, around stipends, and the total spend on relocation. You can see that Mayor Scott has invested significantly in reducing the likelihood of retaliation or re-victimization by accounting for the need to move someone out of the neighborhood that they just got shot in if necessary. And we are well over having invested $200,000 thus far in assisting GVRS participants.
Director, just one quick question. For this graph in particular, purple notes the total spend on reallocation. Is this mutually exclusive, or should that be broken out separately?
So the difference between relocation and housing assistance. So housing assistance could mean that they actually need rental assistance where they are. Housing and relocation is we needed to move an individual or move an entire family.
So would total just include the red and the green?
I'm sorry, you said would the total just
Would
include
the total just include the red and the green? Or
No, the total is the total pie chart.
How do I make sure? So so we're looking at red, green, purple. Purple is noted as total spend on relocation.
Yes.
Green is housing. Green is housing assistance amount paid, and red is stipend amount in U.S. dollars. So is purple? Should purple be considered the combination of housing assistance amount paid and stipend amount?
It should not. So the stipend amount paid to date is $64,000. I know that the graphs are probably hard to see on the screen. So $64,000 makes up about 26% of the funds spent. That's in red. In green, we've got $95,000, or roughly 37%, around housing assistance, and then an additional $96,000, or roughly 37%, in relocation, where you're literally lifting someone and their family up and out.
Got it. Got it. So one is paying for the housing, so on and so forth, but then
Yes.
the purple is literally the moving.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
On the next slide, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this slide because there are subsequent slides that kind of spell this out a bit more too. But in the spirit of transparency, wanting to make sure that we shared not only with this body, but also with Baltimore City, what the reason is for the stipends that we are providing. We know that a clear part of this strategy indicates that we've got to make sure that we are providing ample opportunity for folks to make time and space to get to a place of self-actualization, and that could involve CBT training, that could involve transitional employment, it could involve getting a GED, and the need for income in our houses don't stop. Next slide. I am happy to come back to what I believe are going to be the next 3 slides to answer any detailed questions that you all might have. I want to spend the bulk of the time, if the chair is okay with this, in talking about the scale plan. But want to specifically call out that on this slide, we cover the key performance indicators that we're measuring when we're doing shooting reviews in partnership with the Baltimore Police Department and all of those other partners that we mentioned every single Tuesday in the Western District, where we're looking at the number of referrals, we're looking at whether or not scorecards are being regularly presented, we're looking at whether or not we're able to identify priority conflicts or those that are rising up to becoming a bubbling point. And when we're able to get to folks and reach folks. Next slide.
Can you quickly, what is a scorecard? What does that tell us?
So the scorecard is representative of the completion of group audits that are done by the technical advisors in partnership with the Baltimore Police Department that really tell us who the folks are in these group involved incidents, and quite frankly, helps us determine who's at the highest risk of being a shooter or being shot. Also tells us who's most influential and who isn't. And I'll pause here just to check in to see if my partners at BPD would have anything else to add around the scorecards.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Lieutenant Colonel Brown, Criminal Investigations. So if the scorecard is the only thing that I would add, as Director Jackson is saying, it is really a good tool to help us decide on who we should be focusing on, what individuals, that we are seeing that may be, as she's saying, become victim to some retaliatory violence through to the incidents, or they may be the cause or agent of the violence. So, and that is how we make the determination on who we most certainly should focus on.
I see. So the scorecards help us prioritize who we're working with.
And it also allows us to do a really deep dig with the cases as well, to make sure that we're connecting, whether it's intelligence or whether it's some evidence, just for us to go over to make sure that we're not missing any pieces.
Got it. And then the top right bar shows us how often we were completing scorecards when we interacted with folks.
Is that what it's saying?
Or
I'm sorry, sir, the question again?
for the top right graph, we see it turn from red to green. It's going from 0%, looks like a shooting scorecard regularly presented, so 0% presented
Yes.
to now 100% presented.
Yes. This really demonstrates the evolution and the growth of the pilot and everything that we needed to make sure that we were standing up in this pilot district in order to be ready to scale. And so coming into this work, we didn't have scorecards. There were other ways that we were tracking that I believe both the Baltimore Police Department and Monsi and also the deputy mayor thought that we needed to kind of shift away from to make sure that we were in adherence with best practices. And so anytime you see the red kind of shift into green, it's indicative of us making good progress, forward progress.
Okay. And then are any of these graphs telling us how often, so it tells us that we filled out the scorecard or that it was presented, but does any of this tell us how often we're interacting with those high priority targets?
The next slide, Stu.
Excellent. Thank you.
And so this particular slide itself is meant to focus on the KPIs that we have attributed to the shooting review specifically. If there are no other questions on this one, I would ask to advance to the next slide, please. On this slide, we talk about the custom notifications as a result of the work that is done in the shooting reviews. And so through utilization of the scorecards and the identification of folks who are at the highest risk of being shot and or being a shooter, determinations are made, and even potentially known associates who might be interested in retaliating if one of their friends is a victim, for example. The team collectively determines who gets custom notifications. Mm-hmm. And those custom notifications are a subset of what we've called direct communications in previous hearings. So here on these 4 slides, you're looking at 2.1, for example, in the upper right-hand corner is custom notifications conducted per group member involved incident. That's what GMII stands for. And so if we have assessed in partnership with BPD and other partners that a shooting, whether fatal or non-fatal, is a group member involved incident, then we've got benchmarks or KPIs set here that tell us how many folks we believe we should be touching through a custom notification as a result of that incident. 2.2, which is in the bottom right, speaks to the timeline, the time frame. How long is it taking us to get to folks? And so ideally, we want to make sure that we're delivering custom notifications as soon as possible, but no longer than 7 days between us identifying someone and a referral, because that can mean someone's life. If they are at the highest risk of being shot and or being a shooter, we want to get to them quickly. This benchmark is saying, are we reaching the goal of delivering custom notifications within 7 days? In the upper right, upper right for 2.3, these are custom notifications that are conducted per group subject to strategic enforcement investigations. So that really speaks to the custom notifications that are typically law enforcement only notifications because they are strategically targeted. I'm checking in with a partner here.
So this is going to be.
You can, if you want to come up and speak into the mic, that would help, just so folks can hear you online.
Terrence Nash, Deputy Director for the Group Violence Reduction Strategy in Monty. So what that's referring to is when there is a group enforcement action through the strategic enforcement investigation meetings with BPD and partners, that custom notifications are delivered to those individuals that are part of those larger scale investigations.
Got it.
And 2.4 in the bottom right-hand corner is really the percentage of the notifications that have turned into real-life coaching referrals. And so we've made the notification. How many of them are we referring to our community partners that are providing these wraparound supports? And we've made contact. Next slide, please. So this speaks directly to the life coaching for GVRS participants. 3.1 talks about the referrals for GVRS that get directly connected to life coaching and where we are from a benchmarking perspective there. And the pie chart speaks to the percentage of referrals specifically in the 25 and older age group who are receiving stipends of $375 per month or greater. This benchmark in particular was set in partnership with our national technical advisors as a dollar amount that is a baseline around what the expected minimum stipend amount should be in order to incentivize folks and to provide them with opportunities to advance in their lives.
And just to better understand, for the stipend, is the stipend, are these folks working in some job and we pay them a stipend and sort of help them in that capacity, or is it just like a stipend to just kind of get by?
So if we flip back a couple of slides to the breakdown of the GVRS participant stipends by reason for stipend, it's a pie chart, large blue section, if we could,
Page
yep,
8.
right here. And so there are folks who are stipended for making the initial contact. We make a referral. If you go and have a conversation with a referral partner, you'll get $25 for having a conversation. The number of times that you go through a life coaching session, you completing the creation of your resume, you going on a job interview. So these stipends, there are dollar amounts that are assigned per stipend type, and happy to share that with this body if you all are interested in that, that we co-created with National Technical Advisors based on what they're seeing be successful across the country.
Got it. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Cassidy, if you would not mind advancing to.
And I apologize for asking so many questions.
No worries. I thought that we were going to hold for questions, but I'm happy to take them along the way.
I just want to make sure, because there's so much data here, I want to make sure
Yes.
folks don't just blow through it and miss the understanding of it. But this is great. Thank you.
And in the spirit of being, fully transparent, Monty wants to make sure that this council and the public have as much information on GVRS as possible, given the mayor's commitment to scaling it at the top of the year. Oh, I'm trying to catch up on where I left off.
We were at, I think, page 13.
We were at 3.1? Thank you.
Yep.
Great. If we could advance to the next slide where we are talking about the indicators 4.1 through 4.3. So these are GVRS related arrests. These are the group enforcement pieces and the active investigation pieces. And so while up until now, we've spoken specifically about the opportunities that we are affording folks, for folks that decide not to take advantage of those opportunities. They are targeted for enforcement and prosecution. And we make that messaging very clear when we deliver custom notifications. And so 4.1 speaks specifically about GVRS arrests by BPD's GVU versus the total arrests by GVU. 4.2, which is in the bottom left, is the average duration of the group enforcement cycle in days. 4.1, Kyle, we may want to update that. I'm seeing two 4.1s here. 4.1 in the upper right hand corner speaks about GVR. Oh, it's a breakout. Thank you. I appreciate that. And so this is a breakout. If you compare the top two, the first one is the goal of percentage. So what's the percentage of arrests that we want GVU to be making that are specific to GVRS versus non-GVRS arrests? And that benchmark is 80%. And then the corresponding slide to the right of that is the breakout in an integer at the request of Deputy Chief that's sitting to the left of me and me. We really wanted to make sure that we weren't just classifying this in percentages, but that there were whole numbers so that we could see what the total number of arrests looked like. And then last but not least on this page at the bottom right, 4.3, the number of active investigations that are going on. And so as you can see through October, GVU's conducting 3 active investigations right now for targeted law enforcement action.
Great. And actually, I want to give an opportunity, because I have so many questions about this stuff. I want to give an opportunity to my colleagues. But before I do so, I have one question. I'm going to turn it over to Councilwoman Ramos, and if other folks have questions, please let me know. This one is very quickly on the top right one. The GVRS arrests versus total arrests. I noticed, that goes hand in hand with the one on the left that has a goal of 80%. And I'm really curious for that goal, is it good to be above it or below it? And what does that tell us about the effectiveness and efficiency of our relationships with the folks who we have identified as concerning characters in the district?
So I'll start off, but I want to make sure that I punt over to BPD so that they can specifically speak to why GVU is making some arrests that are not connected to the GVRS strategy. Right? I think that is probably contextually important, and then kind of come back to answer your question, if that's okay, sir.
Yeah.
So of course, when GVU is out, our team's out and they're doing investigations and they're patrolling or doing things of that nature, they may see other offenses that are occurring. Of course, we expect them to take some action to it. But they are also pulled to, like, if we have a warrant initiative, we're utilizing them as well, because of course to maximize our staffing and most certainly to bring those warrant numbers down, because most of those, when we do those initiatives, are still on a lot of our offenders that's driving our violence. Also, they may be using some other technology, some surveillance, they see some other things, and even patrol details. So they are still out patrolling, even in some other functions. So whenever they see an incident that is occurring and they can make an arrest, that's part of the expectation. So it's not always our groups that we're talking to, or we are already, working on investigations, it may be some outside ancillary that we're picking them up.
Thank you, ma'am. So, sir, it speaks to the duty to respond, right? Whether something is specific to the work that's happening within the unit or not. So this initial baseline of 80% is one that the technical advisors and Monty and BPD agreed would be the right initial measure. I think that as we pivot into year 2, we'll have to review whether or not it makes sense for this measure to remain the same for the Western District, given that they would have been doing this work for a year, and then using this benchmark for other districts as they come on. It's always going to be better to beat the benchmark, but this is something that the technical advisor suggested that we implement as we were ramping up.
Yeah, it's interesting because I asked that question because that was my initial thought, that it'd be better to be 99%. But I would suggest if the social support services that we're providing to folks, jobs and otherwise, are effective, and those young men are no longer making poor decisions about how they conduct themselves, we would conceptually see that percentage decrease. It could be 70, 60, 50%.
Over time, you're absolutely correct, because we would see less group member involved incidences.
Right. So just sort of conceptual question. With that, I'll hand it over to Councilwoman Ramos, and we'll just kind of go down the line.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question on the second slide, 4-1B, let's call it, right? So the green is, because it's not clear what the green is and what the gray is, because it just says indicator 1, indicator 2. So if you could tell me, I'm assuming that one is regular arrests and one is GVRS arrests. What is this chart saying to us?
Thank you for that question. I think that that's a question that the deputy chief and I asked too when we originally asked for the breakout of this slide. And so what you're seeing here when you see indicator 4.1 in the green, and team, correct me if I'm wrong here, is the number of arrests made by GVU specific to GVRS, and the gray is the number of arrests made by GVRS in totality. And so it is a different representation of the 80%. So if we look at the October numbers, GVU made a total of 76 arrests. 61 of them were specific to group member involved activity.
Oh, okay, I understand. So it's really, the totality of the GVU arrests, and then which ones were the enforcement after the notification that went to them saying, hey, you got to do something. Oh, you're not going to do it? We're going to arrest you, right?
Not necessarily enforcement after the notification. I would say enforcement after notification, or enforcement as a result of, strategic investigations that they're undertaking. This bottom chart immediately underneath of that tells you that, anywhere between 2 and 3 active investigations are going on. And so ideally folks are getting notifications immediately, but in earlier charts, we know that sometimes that takes longer than 7 days. And so it could be a matter of you've gotten a notification to stop the violence, and that would be a law enforcement only notification, because it would be disingenuous to offer an opportunity only to arrest someone 2 days later. Or it could have been as a result of active investigations.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I just needed some clarity on that slide. I have some conceptual questions, but if we're just on the understanding the slides, I can wait till later.
Ask away, please.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. One question that came to me the other day when I was explaining the strategy to residents in my district, what happens to the guns? So we know we have a lot of guns on the street. I have 15-year-olds and 17-year-olds with guns. We have been talking about this for a long time. Someone comes out of their group, obviously still has a gun. How does this work? Because I don't want that gun to go right back on the street.
So we're going to answer that question, but I think we do want to stick to the
slides, yeah,
for
because
now.
I said I had some
Yeah.
conceptual
No,
questions.
it's a good. I realized that after I answered it. So yeah, you can answer the question. I think just for this section, we'll hold the
We'll
sort of
stick to the
conceptual
slides. That's
questions.
totally
yeah.
fine. Yeah,
Okay. Please.
So I'm sorry, we're answering this one? Okay.
You better answer
okay.
this question because I told her we
Got
honor
it.
that.
So I think it's a really good question. I am going to ask BPD to piggyback on my comments here. Needless to say, if we have someone who has chosen the path of opportunity and to walk away from a potentially violent lifestyle, they aren't necessarily bringing the gun along with them and saying, hey, here you go, run the ballistics test on this, right? And so there absolutely are cases and spaces where guns are going to remain within groups and even potentially within the individuals that we are providing services for. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that those guns are not used in the commission of a violent act. And BPD continues to do record-breaking recoveries of guns, not just in the Western, but across the city. And I would, depend heavily on my partners here to talk about what gun recovery has looked like in the Western specifically.
So to answer your question, Councilwoman Ramos, the goal is to get the gun, right? Because we know that is the tool that they're using to cause some of the violence. Now, most of that comes throughout our investigations. We do follow up with search and seizures and things like that. The goal is always to seize the gun, also making sure that we're building effective cases, very strong cases, especially when we've had incidents and we can narrow down and prove that this is the individual who used this weapon to, commit that act. Sometimes they get passed off before we even get an opportunity to get there to investigate them, but we're using every tool in the toolbox that we can, which is why GVU is really good in their investigations. Like they're doing it thoroughly. Once we come out of the shooting reviews and we identify to say, hey, we're going to pay attention to, let's say, Mo. We're focusing on Mo. And we're going to focus on some associates of her. And if she also has family that may be attached sometimes because we don't know where the retaliation may come from, now we can build those cases better to let us know where we need to dig a little bit deeper in those investigations and what tools that we may need to use as well. Technology as well. Technology is very huge. That has been helping us.
The final piece that I'll add here, ma'am, is that when we enroll folks in services, if you've said that you have made a decision to step away from this, there's a contract that you enter into with these service providers that you are going to adhere to the mandate that you will not have possession of an illegal gun. And that if you do, it's a violation of that contract or that mandate, if you will, around the subscription to these services. And that enforcement is something that we take very seriously.
No, I appreciate that. And I know that we are recovering guns. We are, doing a great job. I had a long conversation with the Northern Major about this yesterday. But there's still guns out there. So I was just kind of wondering how that works once you're in there with a person and all of their associates and trying to figure out what's going on. I don't want that gun going somewhere else.
I think, if I can, as the director said and Deputy Chief said, so the idea is, we're currently 18% up in handgun violations for the year. So we're obviously getting it. I think when they make this contract with Muncie to change their lives for the better, as the commissioner has often said, this is a conscious decision to pick that gun up. So when they enter into this contract with Muncie in reference to this change of life, we believe that they are now becoming also an ambassador for not using these communal guns that are within the organization and group, but they're also spreading the word of why they're not doing it to their counterparts. So that's that conscious decision of, I know it's there, it may not be my personal gun, but it may be the group gun, and now I'm not picking it up, but I'm also being this ambassador of making this conscious decision to not use violence as a means to an end.
But I think they need to be encouraged to turn it in, to get rid of it, to do something, because I can't have more of our young people have illegal guns.
I don't disagree with you. We have had some conversations as a part of my involvement with the Community Violence Intervention Collaborative at the White House. There are some jurisdictions that are offering safe surrenders of guns, if you will, through community-based organizations. That's something that Monty has had some very light conversations around, but your point is well taken around doing our job in partnership with BPD around recovery.
And I get that you have to first gain trust. I get that, right? And gaining trust and saying, we really want you to do X, Y, and Z. So then telling them to say, you've got to do something, like, I get that, but this is a huge priority.
Yeah.
To get to figure out what we're going to do with these guns. So just to add it to the mix of, I know you've got a million other things going on, but I think it's important because I just can't have more of our young people having guns. And so thank you, Mr. Chair. I have more questions, but I'll ask those later. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilwoman Porter.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Director Jackson, I had a few quick questions related to one, the understanding and sustainability of the stipends. Could you share how many successfully triage into sustainable employment after, after they successfully kind of receive the stipend for a period of time?
Thanks for your question. Want to remind folks that the pilot just got stood up in January, and that we wanted to make sure that we had protocols in place around stipend amounts so that there was consistency around when stipending would happen and when it wouldn't happen. I would offer that we didn't see consistency across our service providers around stipending until probably about 2 or 3 months ago.
Okay.
There were stipends being given out, but from a consistent perspective around the benchmarking. I would say that we have seen folks enroll in free CDL training through referrals from these partners. We have seen folks relocate their entire families and not be re-victimized by folks that have shot them or recidivated. But I would have to get you the hard numbers back. I want to caution us, given that we're roughly 9 months in. How do we define long-term benefits of this work versus the short-term immediate benefits that we're seeing right now, and know that we're being really thoughtful about what we're calling the ROI in MONSE, which isn't the return on investment, but instead the results, outcomes, and impacts that the chair and I talk about when we think about the KPIs not just being efficiency benchmarks.
Sure. And no, I appreciate that. One of the things that, I've been flagging for a few agencies, making sure that we have short-term, intermediate, and long-term. So, when you provide possibly a report to the chair or the council, that's what I'm going to be looking for, making sure that we have that numbers, that accurate data estimate, kind of like how many stipends and the overall total of stipends that we're giving out, and making sure that it correlates with the overall quality of life impact of that individual. So when I think about like successful housing, successful employment, you have an indicator in there which is 90 days successful for employment. And so making sure that we are constantly seeing that growth, but also seeing the reduction in the services where the chair talked about it originally in his presentation about. So we should be seeing some correlating effects to that. So, Mr. Chair, can I ask another question?
Yep.
Okay. My next question has to do with scaling and the sustainability of this program after the 2-year period. And I know you're going to go through that, but I just want to flag that it is of concern to me, given our budget that we have here in the city. Again, I want to make sure that if we are providing this type of not only life coaching, financial, educational, housing assistance, we have some sort of catchment from our city agencies, hint, hint, brick, brick, that they can sustain this for a prolonged period of time.
I couldn't agree with you more. Obviously, we're using the mayor's ARPA investment over the next 2 years to make sure that we're able to account for transitional housing, stipends, relocation. And we're simultaneously partnering with the commissioner who's sitting here to my left around what criteria should look like associated with GVRS participants and other high-risk participants around housing relocation, so that it's something that is built into her budget, and is something that we can tap into. So I would say that Commissioner Kennedy and I have had those initial conversations, and it hasn't just been us. We've also included the Mayor's Office of Employment Development around transitional employment. So Director Perkins Cohen, and making sure that we're being effective stewards of city resources and planning those out.
And I'll save my other questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And I just want to echo your sentiments because you're spot on. And I think this is a conversation we had a couple of times. Specifically, I want to echo that sentiment for our police department and the resources that we're putting into sort of staffing and supporting, GVRS. Because I know we have a pretty intense support services, and we have a unit doing a lot of work in the Western District. Of course, it goes beyond the Western District. But thinking about as we look to expand, which we're going to get into a little bit later, what that means for the department. Can we sustain this citywide or near citywide, and can we project out what that cost may look like, knowing that we are seeing some success here. So I'll pass it on to Councilman Cohen.
I'm going to wait until we're finished with the whole presentation and have a couple questions about sort of the overarching program, but we'll catch you on the backside of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Glover.
Yeah, I'm going to wait as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Please continue, Director.
All right, if we go to the next slide here, and I think we only have 2 or 3 graphs left before we talk about scale. This next slide represents charges that are deemed significant, and happy to talk about, or to kind of hand that over to my partner here to my left, because there have been a lot of conversations about what we deem significant charges. The percentage and the actual number of crime drop as a result of this strategy 90 days prior to an investigation and 90 days post an investigation. And so what you're looking at in indicator 4.4 is the percentage of charges and convictions that have been produced based on what we consider those significant violent drivers, and then 4.5 is the percentage of crime drop pre and post those investigations completed by BPD. This one specifically connects directly to the Poe Homes takedown that happened not too long ago. If there are no questions about this page, we'll go to the next slide. So 4.6 is specific to prosecution of violent group members. And so obviously we've spoken about the opportunities that we want to afford folks. We've spoken about the law enforcement component of the work connected to GVU. And obviously if we're telling folks step away or deal with the consequences, then we want to make sure that consequences are in place. What you're looking at here in 4.6 is the prosecution of violent group members. Total charged is this first bar that you see. The second bar is SAO prosecution, SAO pending. It also includes stets and null process, guilty verdicts, and brings in not just the SAO's office, but the Attorney General's office and the USAO's office in this work here. And the next page speaks specifically to a breakout provided by the state's attorney's office, and so it may make sense for me to just let Deputy Chief speak about this one.
Thank you. Jan Bledsoe, Chief Deputy at the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office. Unfortunately, there's an error in this slide which I had asked to be corrected. The cases should be 39. The active cases should be 21. But these are cases that are circuit court cases, so cases that have been indicted. And we also look to see why cases were either null prossed or steaded, so that we can work with BPD about what's going on. And you'll see that 3 of them were because it was a necessary witness, and then one was a plea negotiations in another case.
Thank you. And so that actually wraps up the presentation of GVRS STAT. And happy to jump right into the scale up considerations unless you'd like to pause here, sir.
Give me 1 second. I'm just going to take a peek ahead.
Mr. Chair, I have a question on this slide.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. So you said that the cases were actually 39 and the active cases are?
Go back, thank you, Cassidy. So the active cases, I think that I heard Ms.
21,
Bledsoe
okay.
speak to are 39, and then the cases are 39, active cases are 21.
Okay, great. And then the police officer not present, why? Just trying to figure out, you know, if there's.
Colonel Jones, so I'll just give you an idea. So one case that we're aware of is an officer was on military leave. So he was not able to make the case in reference to that, and the case would not be postponed. So those are situations where, you know, for whatever reason are outside of our control, but something like that would be a reason why an FTA for an officer not being present at the case.
So did it get postponed until he comes back, or?
It did
was
not get
dismissed?
postponed. That's why it was dismissed. He was on military leave away. Case was
These
not.
cases are dismissed. I mean, it's not a lot of them, but, you know.
But any
whenever
case
you
that
see-
does not, but any case we realize that does not go through the full judicial process is a concern of ours. So we try
Right.
to make every effort and with notification through the system of when a court date is coming up to make the officer available for that. And then there's sometimes extenuating circumstances where the officer will not be. But as you said, even though it's only three is still an unacceptable number because these cases matter.
Right. Yeah, so you're looking into these
Yes,
to try
ma'am.
to figure out what happened and to prevent that from happening? Because I hope the next time we see this, it's going to be a 0.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Councilwoman, let me just also say that when we don't have the necessary witness, we ask for a postponement because we certainly understand if we have an officer on military leave,
Sure.
and it is up to the courts to make that decision,
Okay.
and oftentimes they will deny our postponement.
Uh-huh. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Councilwoman.
Thank you. And so just back to that slide real quick. So we have the total cases for 39. How many participants, like overall? So it's 39 of, what's the total denominator for that?
I'm sorry, I would not have the number of defendants
Okay.
in that. I would imagine if we did it, I think we did it by CC number, which would mean.
A 1 to
for-
1?
Yeah,
Okay,
1 for 1.
1-to-1 ratio.
Yep.
Okay, and so how many total participants in the entire program? I'm trying to understand the total pie of how many participants were in the program versus the number of cases that actually went to circuit court.
And these are circuit court cases?
Yes,
Okay, so,
agreed.
because there are district court cases that haven't been indicted yet.
Okay, that's a
So
good point.
So there's a difference in
There's a
numbers when
different-
you
there's a
look at the
different
two
ratio
slides
there.
because, things progress.
Okay.
So district court, there were maybe juvenile cases
Yes.
that were transferred back.
Okay.
So that we would not be able to include them because they're no longer circuit court cases and they're juveniles, so they're.
Yeah, and so the reason, I'm sorry, Director Jackson, go ahead, ma'am.
No worries. And so the numerator and the denominator, I think for the SAO's office looks very different than the numerator and denominator for Monty, right? And so as we think about the total number of GVR arrests year to date, we're talking about 69. That is at the beginning
Yes.
of this slide. To the point just made, some of those cases are federal cases, some of those cases are local cases. And your question about the number of total participants, we have direct communication at 102 individuals. We know that we have seen 70 folks accept those services split across our 2 providers.
Okay, that definitely helps a lot because again, I'm looking at the total dollar amount spent per person, per program, whether it be between Monty and the State's Attorney's Office for return on investment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hey, Director Jackson, how you doing?
I'm well, sir, thank you.
I have a question. So I know that Monty received a whole lot of money through ARPA funds and things of that nature. I want to know that are there any other crime reduction groups that you guys have distributed any of those funds to that are helping with the effort of keeping our young people, off streets, out of trouble, and committing a lot of the gun violence that we see going on today in our communities?
Yes, sir, absolutely. So I would say specific to the group violence reduction strategy, we are working with youth advocate programs, which is a community-based organization, and we are working with ROCA. They respectively manage 2 age groups, the 25 and older and the 25 and younger age groups. With regard to community violence intervention work, which we aren't necessarily focusing on in this moment, there are a whole host, dozens of community-based organizations that we have funded as a part of the mayor's investment in this work. And as GVRS and CVI become more and more integrated, specifically around the victim services spaces and the life coaching spaces and the community moral voice spaces, we'll see the intersections of that funding. To date, we've awarded over $18 million.
Okay, so can you kind of give me an idea or list like any of the organizations that are in East Baltimore? You know, my particular district is around the Miami Street area. I know, of course, you have Safe Streets that are there, but they're no longer there on Miami Street. We had some, shootings recently in that area. Right now, today, like, are there any in existence in that area? Because they're no longer in that building anymore.
I absolutely can get the full list for you. I would think that, but what comes to mind for me is the award to Uncle T and Challenge for Change. They did receive direct awards from MONSE associated with community violence intervention work, and has been partnering with us for the last few months. That's the one that comes top of mind. I am happy to provide you with a detailed list. As we do when we make the awards, we send the list out to the council.
Okay, but again, is Safe Streets, they're no longer in that building. So what area, like where are they right now as we speak? Like we don't have them in the community anymore.
So as a part of the transition from living classrooms over to LifeBridge Health, one of the things that MONSE found in doing its internal investigation is that facility was not suitable to serve high-risk population. There was one way in, one way out, up steps. We didn't necessarily see a lot of high-risk individuals being willing to go in a building that they could not necessarily get out of. The HVAC system did not work in that building, and so while that site is being rebooted, we are using another location within the community for those team members to meet at, to do their daily briefings and to do their canvassing. And so while they aren't physically in that building, they are still very much working in that catchment area.
Yeah, I'm just asking like where's the location? Like I would like to know.
I believe that they are working very closely with Pastor Gary and with David Grant, but would need to get back to you. The last conversation that I had was, are we gonna have folks meet in the church or are we gonna have folks meet at the community center? So I would need to get back to you, but I have been told by my team that they are meeting within the community because it's important for them to still be there even as we're rebooting the site.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And Councilman, we will be revisiting the last hearing that we had. We're going to bring it back. So we'll have an opportunity to dig into all those questions again later on. Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Jackson, and all the assembled agencies. I want to ask about some of the collateral damage from some of the folks who have been involved in group-related violence, and specifically the question of families and the impact that violence has on immediate family, extended family, and then community. And I'm curious, as we think about GVRS in the Western and some of the promising data showing reductions among the folks who have been group involved there, and then thinking about ultimately scaling, thinking from a trauma-informed lens and knowing that violence is a disease that spreads from person to person and that families become implicated in it, whether it's parents, siblings, children, et cetera. I'm curious what we're doing to support not just the individuals that we're attempting to extract from groups and then support with other resources, but their families, because a lot of folks have kids, a lot of folks have, are able to and I think this strategy speaks to this, are able to influence a number of people in their network and in their immediate family. So what supports are we thinking about or are we putting in place for the family of folks who we are attempting to transition out of this work?
Thank you for your question. I think that reiterates the point that I was making before about the intersection between victim services and life coaching. Victim services, from our perspective, is not just about the provision of services to the direct victim of a gunshot wound. It is, by extension, that person's family, that person's community. And what the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement has been doing has been multi-pronged, from rolling out coordinated neighborhood stabilization responses, where in cases where we're seeing certain types of activating events, standing up for 45 days, a continuous presence within a 6-block square radius with the location of the incident being at the epicenter, partnering with schools and rec centers and other agencies and community-based organizations. We are actually working with folks that live in these communities to serve as the community project manager, if you will, because they're the ones with the qualitative data around whether or not what we're doing is actually stabilizing a community or not. And that's where we get to bring in this network of resource providers that we're working with, whether we're talking about ROAR or Turnaround, or talking about Baltimore Ceasefire or We Are Us, or talking about bringing in mental health on the Leonard Street activation, where we saw a young person lose her life. I Am Mentality partnered with MONSE and with that community to provide mental health supports. We had mental health resource fairs and engagement with young folks at the school in that neighborhood. And so I would say that there are a whole host of opportunities that we have and a whole host of opportunities that we have taken advantage of to make sure that we are treating the entirety of the disease, because we understand how contagious it is.
No, I appreciate that, and I know that in speaking pretty extensively to your chief of staff, there's a lot of work that we're doing around victim services and a lot of, I would say, a real need for deep coordination among agencies and service providers. And so I definitely appreciate that work. I will press and maybe just shift the question a little bit to say, my understanding of the strategy, GVRS, is that these are individuals who are group connected and who have influence, clout, can either push in a positive direction or in a negative direction, and have often, unfortunately, spent energy pushing in a negative direction and have followers and have folks that come behind them. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I'm going to assume that a lot of the folks that we are targeting, that we're working to extract from the negative consequences of their decisions, are also the financial providers for their families in many cases. And so I wonder just about, and I know you mentioned the stipends and the work through life coaching, connect people with employment and other opportunities. I just wonder if there's a direct opportunity to work with folks' families, like their direct families, whether it's kids, sibling, significant other, spouse, girlfriend, mother, whatever the connection may be, because most folks respect their own family, and if we're all kind of working on this together, I think we could accomplish a lot. And just thinking again from a sort of trauma-informed perspective, the focus on how we work, not just with individuals, but with family and then broader community family structures, I think is important.
Thank you for your question. So going back to the beginning of your statement, just because I don't want to oversimplify what GVRS is and what it's not, every group member involved individual doesn't have clout. Some do, some don't. I will also say that we have seen folks who have decided to take advantage of the opportunities afforded to them, have conversations with other group members and bring those group members along. to discussions and conversations with service providers. To the more specific point that you were making around making sure that we are accounting for familial supports that need to be in place so that we can break intergenerational cycles of violence. Those two are very much a part of this work. We have participants who have been victims of gunshots, who have relocated their entire family, who have communicated to us that in addition to them needing ongoing medical care for themselves and support for themselves, that they also want to make sure that they get the appropriate care that they need for their children, for their extended family members. And it's a part of the relationships that they have with our community service providers that those connections get made.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Director Jackson, I've got a question as well. I think it kind of stems off of a little bit what Councilman Cohen was asking and a little bit of what Councilwoman Porter had asked earlier. When I think about the progression of folks through this program, essentially we identify a location that's got a lot of violent crime. We've identified the Western District. We then map out the folks who are part of the groups or associated and have the capacity to act violently. We then target those folks with either enforcement or services. We talked a lot about today the life coaching. We also talked about the stipend and the other supports that we provide folks. Councilwoman Porter sort of touched on this, worried about the resources to continue to provide that and even more to scale it up. I'm really curious, at what point when do we know that we've succeeded with an individual or with a group, such that they no longer need to rely on our resources, rely on our program, so we can focus on the next group or the next individual? Have we thought about that finish line? I ask that because it's not quite here in the data, but I'm sure
Yeah, I would offer that we're not focusing on groups sequentially.
okay.
That we are making sure that we are engaging folks both proactively and reactively, obviously, in response to non-fatal and fatal shootings. But we're looking at multiple groups simultaneously through the problem analysis that we completed, and Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong here, initially going into the Western District, we thought that we had about 18 active groups. Having done subsequent analysis, now that we have been in there, we're well over 50 groups. Is that right? We're well over 50 groups. And so there's no way that we would be able to ask law enforcement partners and community-based partners to focus on those one at a time. Because we would never be done. There would never be a true measure of success. And so we manage our intel appropriately to make sure that we understand who the top 5, top 10, 25 groups are as we think about what law enforcement, strategic law enforcement approaches should look like, but also what our engagement should look like with those individuals. To answer your question specifically about when is success achieved, that's gonna be—
I don't mean for the broader program. I'm talking—
You mean for an individual, right?
For an individual,
Right.
or
Yeah.
if we're looking at a group,
Yep.
a group that we've targeted.
So I could quite frankly be sunshiny and roses and say it's achieved when someone reaches like their self-actualized version, right, where they've transcended. What I will say, right? What I will say instead is that what success looks like over time is we don't see folks, we don't see an individual become re-victimized after a certain point of time. We don't see them victimize anyone else or become a person of interest in victimizing someone else. We don't see them recidivate. We don't see them go back to jail. More importantly, we see them getting to the space and place where, whether they're individuals or they have family units, that they're to this place of family sustaining wages, where they're at this place where we know that they're getting the appropriate mental health supports, where they are getting their needs met and they are able to meet their own needs, and that it's going to be individualized. Do we have KPIs that will tell us when we believe we have succeeded? Yes, and we are very clear that success is going to look different for each individual.
Yep. I'm That's the answer I was looking for. Thank you. I think to Councilman Cohen's point about the family and the reasons they may be making the decisions that they're making in the moment, understanding a family supporting wage, understanding whatever mental issues they may be dealing with, and how that affects their ability to regulate or not regulate on the street, I think it's really, really important. So I would love to see that developed over time. I know we're not even a year yet into the program, but understanding what that finish line looks like, I think is really important to understanding when we can move to the next individual or to the next district or otherwise. So
Understood.
thank you. I'm going to move on if you could please continue. I know we have all these questions, but I know this is
No worries, no worries. Always happy to have opportunities to educate and inform Baltimoreans about the work that we're doing. Let's go to next slide here. So we're going to jump really into what the scale-up considerations have been. And I want to be really clear in saying that Monty wouldn't be able to do this work without its partnership with the Baltimore Police Department and with the state's attorney's office. We meet every single week. In fact, our weekly meeting is tonight. Our strategy meeting is tonight. We meet every week to talk about what's working, what's not working tactically, and to have concentrated time to talk about the strategy. And so the first point that I want to make here around redistricting is that we are absolutely factoring in redistricting in what the scale up of GVRS is going to look like. Baltimoreans know that these district boundaries have been redrawn in ways that are meant to make sure that BPD can balance the allocation of personnel and resources that account for our population density today. The point that I want to make specific to the GVRS strategy here, though, is that the redrawing of the district boundaries are absolutely going to reshape what the distribution of gun violence looks like relatively. And we factored that in. We know that the redistricting changes are set to go into effect at the top of the year, around the same time that we're looking to honor the mayor's commitment of scale up. Next slide. I'm going to talk specifically about redistricting's impact on the Western, because that's where we are right now. So this map shows you what the Western will inherit from the Central, what the Western will inherit from the Southwestern, and what it will give up to the Southwestern. You can see that the Western District is going to get a lot of the Central District, and it's going to swap some areas with the Southwestern. Based on what our current analyses tell us around the districts as they are made up now, the Western's going to absorb an additional 9% of homicides and non-fatal shootings. So that means that the Western alone will account for 15% of the total citywide homicides and non-fatals. Next slide. And so as we think through expansion, we are hyper aware of the fact that the successes that we've seen in the Western have activated in a lot of folks, the need to move quickly in scaling GVRS. As I mentioned before, the mayor made a commitment that we would be doing that by early 2023, and he stands by that commitment. Moving the scale really leaves us with the opportunity to make sure that we're thoughtful about the plan that we've come up with, and that we've got to make sure that the foundation in the Western is really strong, while also initiating expansion into additional districts at a pace and an order. So in a specific sequence to make sure that we don't lose fidelity to the strategy, and so that it truly is sustainable, to the point that many of the council members were making. So want to be really clear in saying that the current level of violence that Baltimore City has, full scale, is not doable in a singular step. There's no way that we're going to be able to go from the Western District and then scale up across the entire city. It is going to take anywhere between 3 to 4 steps for us to scale. Want to be really clear that that is not equivalent to 3 to 4 years. Steps. I saw the eyes.
I know.
Getting it from
3
all
to
of
4
us.
steps, not 3 to 4 years. I know that in some previous conversations, very early on in the strategy, there were some concerns about whether or not it was going to take us 5 years to get there. These are steps, not years. So next slide, please. Oh. Yep, that's where we're supposed to be. So this initial scale up has to be handled extremely delicately to make sure that we don't just irreparably damage anything that we've done to build the foundation, the Western. We have given a lot of thought and research and taken a look at Chicago, Los Angeles, and even Baltimore when we've tried to do this before. Baltimore's never been able to successfully scale this up across the entire city, even though we've tried before. In fact, the last time we tried in 2014, 2015, we saw major cracks start to expose themselves when the strategy scaled up from the Western to the Eastern District. Next slide. And so continuing along the lessons that we learned from the last time that we tried to do this, the Western the last time around saw a 42% reduction in homicides after that first call in, and we were seeing steady declines through 2015. Not long after we scaled into the Eastern, the strategy just fell apart. I've had conversations with folks who were in the office before it became this office. We've had conversations with law enforcement partners, with national partners, and other folks who have been involved in Baltimore's attempts in the past to make sure that we are not repeating past mistakes. And so while there were a lot of reasons behind what was then called ceasefires, unsuccessful delivery, what most folks tell us is that the foundation was never strong enough from the beginning in the Western, and because of that fragility, we were unable to scale. Next slide. And this kind of drills into what we heard from folks. So while we talked about the foundation, key lessons that we heard were there were a lot of political transitions and a lot of changes in upper management that destabilized the work. So if you don't have continuity around how we're going to deploy this strategy and folks being all on the same page, then it's not going to work. There were not governance and accountability measures that were put in place to make sure that we could expose vulnerabilities sooner rather than later and then mitigate those vulnerabilities. There was also an underinvestment in the management resources and the reforms that needed to take place in order to institutionalize it across all city agencies that would play a part. And then last but certainly not least, our service providers were there, but they weren't necessarily given the level of investment that they needed to make sure that they could honor the commitment that got made around what community engagement was going to look like and service provision was going to look like. And so those folks that we were targeting that were at the highest risk found us to be disingenuous as a city and just did not adopt the program. Next slide. And so as we think about scaling up, what's really rooting me and the team around the principles that we've got to make sure that we've got in place, go back to making sure that we've got that solid foundation. We do believe that we have that in the Western. I can't state enough the partnership between Jan and, at the time, DC Briscoe and now DC Worley that is in place to make sure that we are all in alignment around what this strategy looks like. We know that we can't rush into doing this, that we've got to take into account all of the things that you all have mentioned around BPD resourcing, around making sure that we're using data to make effective decisions, to make sure that we're able to successfully replicate what's happening in the Western across other districts while maintaining what's happening in the Western. And so that is potentially a place where we've got chance for failure. And that's why we're being really intentional about how we do this. It's one thing to say, hey, let's go jump into another district. It's another thing to say, let's jump into another district and maintain 25 to 30% reductions in the Western at the same time. We want to make sure that we're taking advantage of economies of scale. And so it is not likely that we are talking about a 40-person unit across all of the districts. I would say that we are finalizing conversations around what that looks like right now, having involved the deputy mayor, who's given us a decent amount of feedback around his thoughts around what that would look like. And we want to make sure, obviously, that our management processes and the indicators from district to district align across the board at the top, middle, and bottom. Next slide. And so what questions are we asking ourselves to decide where we go next? So what's the next district? What's the order in which we need to go? What are the resources? And I'm not just talking about people. I'm not talking about MONSE resources and SAO resources, BPD resources. I'm talking about technology. I'm talking about infrastructure. I'm talking about training. And I'm talking about a whole host of things. What are the resource and management needs that we have? Do the districts that we add on, as we add them on, do they join into what the Western is doing? Or are we duplicating the cycle, right? And so are we bringing them in, for example, into a Western District shooting review, or are we conducting separate shooting reviews? And if so, why? And the same thing for coordination meetings, why? While at the same time keeping in account all of the resources that we would need to bring to scale. And then finally, how many steps to achieve full scale, and what's the timeline look like? I think that all of the members of this council received an email from my office yesterday indicating that we are interested in scheduling time with you all to discuss the mayor's plan in detail over the coming weeks to answer any questions that you might have, and then conducting, a public hearing for that. So next slide. Here's kind of where we landed. So the priority expansion districts have to have a group violence challenge. By definition, that's what GVRS is. They have to have a shared, interconnected group violence dynamics with the GVRS districts that we're in. And so to speak plainly, they gotta have a group violence issue, and it's gotta be some cross connection between the Western, since the Western is the first district that we've been in. We have to make sure that we are not outstripping capacity from a staffing and infrastructure perspective, and that the direction in which we head, the sequencing of the districts that we choose, benefit the entirety of the expansion plan. And so I'll close with this final slide here, which really talks about the work that we've been doing to date. You can see, and this work has been going on even long before August, but you can see that we've been really intentional about partnering not just with the technical advisors, but also with the agencies that sit with me now to make sure that it works this time, because it has to. So where we are right now is obviously the presentation to you all of where we are right now is around updating you all on GVRS and some high level discussions around what scale up looks like. And then in mid to late November or early December, we're really looking to come back for the year end hearing and to do the full presentation, not only to this council, but to Baltimore City at large around the mayor's plan. And then beginning that scale up in early 2023 as the mayor's committed. I am happy to answer any questions. I'm also happy to pivot questions over to other partner members.
We'll start on this end and work our way across. Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Jackson. Thank you to, again, your whole team and everyone that's here. I'll just acknowledge attention, which is that I think folks feel a desperate sense of urgency around the violence that Baltimoreans are experiencing, whether that's gun violence, whether that's carjacking, robbery, just the tremendous amount of violence that living in the city we all experience. And so I will say that I think it is critically important, to your point, that we get this right, even if that means that the scale up is not as fast as I would like in Southeast Baltimore. I think that we've done it. I mean, this is our third bite at the apple. I don't think there's going to be a fourth. And so we're not in a position where we can rush or we can make any kind of mistakes. Now, that said, though, I do think it is critically important, however long that scale up takes, and I am putting faith because your agency is the expert in this work, and you've developed these partnerships with state's attorney, with BPD, with all our nonprofit organizations, that you are making thoughtful, diligent decisions on how to move. That said, though, it is critically important that while we scale GVRS up in a way that's thoughtful and intentional, that we do all the other things well that your office and that our entire public safety apparatus has been charged with doing. And that means making sure that contracts are on time and paid out in full. That means making sure that our partners, all of our partners in law enforcement, are held fully accountable to the highest possible standards, that we're continuing to build partnerships across all these lines. We can't wait for 3 steps or 4 steps if we're not also doing the work on the other side of reducing violence and harm. And so, apologies, more of a statement than a question. I guess the question really is, while we do this intentional build-up, while we make sure we're not getting it wrong a 3rd time in a row, can you talk just a little bit about some of the other supports that are going to be in place? My colleague was mentioning Safe Streets. We know that that's transitioned from a host of smaller nonprofit partners to LifeBridge and Catholic Charities. Could you talk about supplementing for districts that are not the Western and areas that are not the Western, what resources MONSE is providing and we are making available to communities?
Thank you for your question. Absolutely. I think that we've been really, or at least I'm hoping that we've been really clear that while the group violence reduction strategy is one of the approaches that we are taking in order to achieve the comprehensive violence reduction that the mayor has charged us with implementing, it's not the only approach. It's an integrated approach. And so you mentioned another approach, and I'll say community violence intervention and not necessarily Safe Streets, because for so long, because CVI has been seen through the lens of Safe Streets only, because it's been here since 2007, my team and I, and even many of our Safe Streets workers, are under the impression that folks believe that Safe Streets is synonymous with CVI, when in fact it is a CVI program. Uncle T has a CVI program. So does We Are Us. So does Lisa Moloch at Let's Thrive. So do a whole host of other partners that we are partnering with, because community violence intervention is rooted in community moral voice. And a credible messenger doesn't need to be someone that has a criminal record. If you are credible to the individual that you're having conversations with and to, then you're a credible messenger. So I want to say that out loud when we think about community violence intervention. I also want to say that community violence intervention in this ecosystem that we're building to account for addressing issues now isn't just about those folks that are doing violence intervention work. It is also about those folks that are providing mental health supports, those folks that are providing victim services, those folks that are providing a whole host of other wraparound services. And so those things are happening right now in communities. MONSE has run numbers to tell us what the top 25 most violent neighborhoods are. And that's because people live in neighborhoods and don't necessarily think about their lives through the lens of BPD posts. No offense to my partners at BPD. And so being really thoughtful about how we begin to go into those neighborhoods to hyper-localize what community violence intervention and partnership with BPD looks like is what the data team and the CVI team and I are talking about right now, so that there's work happening both in the short term and in the midterm, or in the long term. The last thing that I'll say, and I'll want to turn it over to my partners here at BPD, is that while both the police commissioner and I both agree that policing alone is not going to reduce violence in our communities, there's a deep partnership between my agency and his agency. And so while there are initiatives that we are partnering on together and separately, I don't want us to unsee or not recognize the fact that BPD and their deployment strategies change in response to what is happening, both from a proactivity perspective and from a reactivity perspective. And so I would punt over to them to also talk about the work that they are doing, how it crosses into the Monty space, whether it's neighborhood policing plans, whether it is work associated with pre-arrest youth diversion so that we aren't pushing our young people unnecessarily into the criminal justice system, or a whole host of other things. But I hear you loud and clear. The work is happening today, the work's happening for tomorrow, and the work is happening for next year.
Thank you, Director Jackson. Sarah Ritter with BPD, Office of the Deputy Commissioner of Operations. As Director Jackson mentioned, we, in alignment with GVRS, are working on a lot of other strategies. Victim services, our victim services team covers and supports family members of all homicide families citywide. We are working to scale to support non-fatal shooting victims right now in the Western, aligned with GVRS, but we're also expanding that team and are already working in the Southern District as well to support non-fatal shooting victims. Youth diversion, as she mentioned, I mean, there's a whole host of other programs that are covering other geographies, neighborhood policing plans, and you'll hear later about sort of our community policing plans and how we're building up our neighborhood coordination officer program and bringing in some new capacity support there as well. So we are thinking citywide while we're also looking, to scale correctly the GVRS strategy.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and thank you, Director Jackson. And just to close, I understand the work that you all are doing and appreciate it. And we are continuing to lose neighbors and fathers and brothers and sisters and mothers in this city, and it is excruciating and painful. And just about every day, Tony and I and Mark and everyone else get a little text telling us who got shot or killed in our district, and it really hurts. And so understanding the need to do this right, balanced with the urgency of this moment, I think is important. I do believe you are on it and that this is your mission. I will just say that it is mission critical, and there ain't gonna be a fourth bite at the apple.
Understood, sir.
Thank you, Councilman. I want to echo the sentiments of the councilman. I think we're still in a tough place as a city. This program, I'd say, is going well. We're still in a tough place as a city, and I think having those two realities vibe is really, really, really important for us. I was kind of going through the slides. One of the things I noted was the breakdown between our districts and where we're seeing spikes, and the Northeastern has seen a significant spike, a 101.9% spike over the last year, which is scary, it's concerning. Northeast is typically not a major location for violent crime. My residents reach out to me, my constituents reach out to me all the time about their frustration and concern. That doesn't take away from the success that we're seeing in this program. And Director, I think why you constantly hear from the council on when's the next step, when's the next foot going to drop, when are we going to expand, it's because I think well, many of us do see the utility and the success of the program. We also see the flip side, how we're not winning in other parts of the city, and I think we need to be honest about that. What we're seeing in other parts of the city are not okay. It's just not acceptable, and I think you're going to always see from us an urge to do more, to push. I think you're right about some of what we saw in the initial, or the second rendition of this program under ceasefire. I also think just the reality of the program fell apart when Freddie Gray happened. Freddie Gray forever changed our city. I remember I was here. I was working in the mayor's office, working with exactly the people who were in your seat before. And I remember, the police department and all that it was going through at the time. And, we're still going through some of that in the police department. It's gotten significantly better, but we still have work to do. So I think, once again, I'm happy to see the progress that we're having. I think it's great. I think it's good. I think we reasonably have questions about sustainability, the ability to scale, the resources both for Monty and the support services that you provide to the young men typically who are engaged with the program, and then also to the police department by way of all the analysis, all the investigations and otherwise that we do to make sure that we do the enforcement when it's needed. But we still have a pretty good ways to go, and I have to agree with my colleague. The urgency is really on us. It is really important that we get it right. And those are two realities we have to live with as well. So just want to thank you for going through it all. Also really want to thank you for using data, because I hate having these conversations where it's all hand-wavy, but when we can have a good sense of what's going on, even if it's not perfect, it really helps me to wrap my head around it, and I'm sure my colleagues appreciate it as well. And I think what's more is it'll inform us significantly into the future on the success of the program and what we can learn in that next iteration and the iteration after. So that's just my 4 cents. But yeah, I just want to hand it off. And any other questions, comments? Councilwoman Porter, and then Ramos.
I did have a few other questions. So we talked through kind of how you all kind of gain participants for the program. Can you share the delineation between how you all operate and how ROCA operates, and if there's any synergy there? Because the only reason why I'm asking that question is because they are allotted a certain amount of money related to their budget, related to their recruitment and program operations. I want to make sure that we have some delineation between the two programs.
Thanks for the question. So contextually, ROCA is funded out of Monty's budget to the tune of about $900,000, almost close to $1 million a year, or at least starting this year. They just ended a 4-year contract at the end of last fiscal year. ROCA is currently our community-based service provider that is working directly with the young folks that we are identifying as group-involved individuals.
So
and
it's
so
by
folks
age.
who are, yes,
Okay.
and so folks who are under the age of 25 are currently being referred to ROCA.
Okay, that was a great clarification. Thank you for that, ma'am. And then I wanted to talk through the collaborative efforts following up on Councilman Cohen's question related to trauma. So earlier this year, we went through budget hearings where Baltimore City Public Schools posed wellness teams that go out into the community that from my recollection, includes some of the stakeholders that you are talking about. Can you talk about the collaborative efforts between your office and Baltimore City Public Schools? Again, what I am doing is looking at the duplicative nature of, the perceived duplicative nature, and I want the general public to really understand that, we are including Baltimore City Public Schools and other community-based organizations within this plan that you are developing and executing.
Absolutely, and that partnership with BCPSS and the team over the district is not specific to the group violence reduction strategy. I would consider it a very not to overuse this word, holistic approach in how we are engaging them. As I think about the coordinated neighborhood stabilization responses, the team is very intentional about making sure that we're staging at schools or rec centers, because we know that we need to immediately address the trauma of not just the direct victim, who obviously needs our support and or their family members and witnesses, but for folks that live in the community, folks that go to school in the community. Studies tell us that children who hear gunshots in their neighborhoods are increasingly less likely to want to attend school or choose not to go to school. They begin to develop antisocial behaviors, that they are the ones who are so fearful and who have such levels of anxiety that they begin to carry guns to protect themselves, even if they've never had any group member involvement. And so it is with a deep understanding that we have partnered with Baltimore City Public Schools. We engage with the Family and Community Engagement Center, which falls under Tina Hike-Hubbard's team on a regular basis. Those, in fact, were the team members that we worked with in identifying the 3 high schools that we were going to go into around, deploying intervention specialists and working with students as ambassadors. And so it's with a deep level of intentionality that we partner with them. We're also partnering with the Student Wholeness Office, because that speaks to all of the emotional regulation and the intelligence, emotional intelligence quotient and the restorative practices that need to happen in elementary and middle schools, even before you get to this place where violence is what you resort to. And so I would offer that the engagement is deep with them, and they are one of the partners that we bring out when we need to go into communities, because they've got the closest connections to Baltimore City Public School students.
And I appreciate that response. And another reason why I bring that up is because, similar to Chair Conway's point, I want to see the continuity of data reported between the agencies, because it may have been a couple hearings ago where we were talking about a platform that allows for, am I thinking about that correctly?
The legislation just passed this last session at the state level that will allow for data sharing across agencies. It never existed before. It was something that Mayor Scott's administration fought very hard for.
Okay, and is that going to be public-private data or just simply within the confines of the city?
That's something that I would have to follow up with you on. That's owned by Deputy Mayor Leach's portfolio, so I don't know the answer to that.
Why I bring that up is because when we have, and for instance, in South Baltimore, as you are aware, we have 2 hospital violence interrupted programs, and I want to make sure that the information is being shared across platforms that are kind of working in public safety as well. So if you could follow up and just let me know that would be
I believe
great.
it does, just FYI, yes.
I'm sorry, say again?
So it has to be a data sharing agreement if it does?
Yeah, there would have to be, obviously, because of HIPAA rules, so there would have to be some way of data sharing, but that's a way to track everybody as to where they're going, so.
Yeah, but I
that's
don't know if
important.
that was included in the legislation.
That was my understanding, so we should,
If you could follow up, that would be great.
I'm happy to follow up. So I want to make sure that we differentiate between the data sharing that folks within Monty CVI ecosystem are going to be required to do in order to make sure that we're truly shifting and transforming what violence looks like in our city against this legislation that got passed, because we're, in a lot of cases, dealing with juvenile data, protected data, and so I'm happy to follow up.
Because I'm thinking about data, and this data use agreements, interagency, so okay, so we're on.
Those are things that we've also been discussing.
Yes,
So the data use agreements are things that we've also been discussing at the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council with the mayor, because of all of the local, state, and federal agencies at the table there.
okay. And then with regard to my last question, when we talk about redistricting, one of the things that I know was highlighted in many of the conversations was the movement of officers between districts. Can BPD share how many officers were going to be down with the redistricting? So like for Southern District, are we going to be down 80, 90 officers? With Western, are we going to be down a certain number? So that we have that context in our mind when we're thinking about staffing operations or BPD with this redistricting?
Yep, yes, ma'am. So in reference to the total number, we're still working that out because there's so many factors that go into that. We're talking about calls for service. We're talking about response time. We're talking about how it affects the geography. So we're looking into those things in reference to exactly what does that scaling up or scaling down looks like for that district, because we want them to be even across the board, so there is burden optimization.
Yes.
So we're still working on that, and as soon as our data-driven strategies and our TAs get together, we'll definitely pass that on as soon as we can.
Okay, thank you. And the reason why I asked that is because really to understand the staffing operations I'm really thinking about dollar per officer, dollar per resource. That's how my mind thinks. And so like how, I want to make sure that if we are moving officers, we're having a comprehensive approach to how, like, where are the dollars following the officer or the dollars following the dollars following into the district, if that makes sense.
Understandable.
Okay. And then, Mr. Chair, can I say one more thing before I move on?
We have a second half of the hearing to get to.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Sorry, sir.
Councilwoman Ramos?
I think most of my questions will probably be for that next half, but I just had a question on during the slides that you talked about in terms of housing. I mean, you're spending a significant amount of money on making sure that people are relocated and stably housed. I want to understand, obviously you're having success now, hopefully, in finding places for folks. One of the factors I know that you're thinking about in expansion is making sure that there's available housing for everyone as well. And so can you talk a little bit, and by the way, on the growth, well, I'll talk about that in a second, but if you could answer that question around the housing piece, because the way that I looked at it in the chart and did the math, you're spending almost half of those resources on relocation and assistance for folks. And it is, I think, one of the top needs for residents in our city that are in an unstable, situation.
So I guess I want to talk specifically about relocation as it relates to GVRS, because it's obviously a much larger issue when we think about affordable housing and availability of locations for movement for folks outside of those who are group member involved. Not everyone gets relocated as a part of the group violence reduction strategy. Folks who have expressed interest as a result of victimization are folks who may get relocated, folks who have expressed interest not as a result of re-victimization, but thinking that, in order for me not to become a victim, you're giving me this opportunity now, I need to go. This is also a place where we have partnered with DHCD in making direct connections to landlords and leasing offices and leasing agents that have worked with us to provide housing opportunities for folks anywhere between 6 months and 12 months. And so those dollar amounts are us paying for that long of a time while we're also working with these participants to get them to this place that the councilman talked about around sustainability on their own. I will say that not everyone gets relocated in Baltimore City. And so that is a very real thing too. Some folks have to be relocated outside of the city given their very unique situations. And so I don't know that I can speak about the entirety of the situation around relocation and the housing stock that's available in Baltimore for rent and or lease, but would defer to the commissioner to answer questions that you might have outside of the scope of GVRS.
Yeah, of course. And I think we're aligned on that. I just wanted to, just get a sense of and sort of emphasize the fact that one of the things that helps people get stable is housing.
Yes.
And it seems to me like the relocation is obviously in an emergent situation where, they need to be moved for safety reasons. And then that other part of the pie chart was, look, I just really need a stable place to be.
Right.
And so I think that this sort of ratchets up the emergent situation for me, although it's already up here, in terms of, how do we make sure that stable housing is there, that they don't have to leave. I mean, part of it is leaving your networks because it wasn't so good for you anyway, but part of it is there are some networks, especially for their children and stuff, that they want to maybe maintain. So, but the most important thing is how do we, I just wanted to make sure, as you know, as we're scaling up, that the demand from the folks that you are going to be working with is just going to be that much higher, and I want to make sure that we're working together to make because I will help to try to figure out, like, we've got the landlords. I know the commissioner has been working with the landlords. MOHS has been working to recruit we just need to, I know that you're working on it, but just to put a finer point on it, that's a critical piece. So I'm done, thanks.
Yes, ma'am, thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. All right, we are going to move on to our second half with going over a little on time, but certainly much appreciated. I think we got into a lot of really good discussion. And here we're going to focus on crime prevention through environmental design. So, Director, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, sir. If we could allow just a moment for partner agencies who are here for the second piece to transition in. My staff members indicating that the clicker isn't advancing on the mouse.
Okay. The clicker's not working.
She was so good. Great, thank you. And so a running theme that we're seeing across the mayor's action plan to the members of the committee and to the comprehensive violence prevention plan, we're gonna stay on this first slide here, please, is interagency coordination. And MONSE is really working to deepen its engagement as we scale up our strategies. Our first year for members of the public was our foundational year where we were really looking to build the frameworks, the relationships, the plans, and the pilots to get started on and establish these proofs of concept. And now that we're in our second year, or what we call our framing year, we're standing up more programming associated with the comprehensive violence prevention plan and finalizing those processes, procedures, and protocols. And all the while, we're integrating lessons that we've learned from the work that we've been piloting on a small scale. We just talked about GVRS as one example of that. And so from GVRS to the coordinated neighborhood stabilization response to the CVI ecosystem to any other component that you see on our timeline, the scale up really is gonna necessitate a deeper level of interagency coordination across the administration than Baltimore's ever seen. So in this part of the presentation, we're really gonna be discussing the status of CPTED, or crime prevention through environmental design, here in Baltimore, with a focus on how it shows up in the mayor's comprehensive violence prevention plan and his action plan. Next slide. Great. And so as we think about what CPTED is for members of the public, it's really a multidisciplinary approach that's aimed at reducing victimization by making sure that we're doing the things to deter potential offenders from offending in our community. It changes, it alters what the environment of our neighborhoods and ultimately our whole city looks like in order to prevent and reduce crime. And it works by taking away those opportunities that criminals might have by showing them that the neighborhood's cared for, that it's loved, and that folks have relationships with each other. Next slide. The principles of SEPTED really revolve around these 4 core areas, while there are obviously some extended or more detailed areas: natural surveillance, access control, territorial reinforcement, and maintenance. Natural surveillance really is about eyes on the street and what can you see through clear line of sight. What are we doing to make sure that we aren't reducing visibility? And as a result, giving criminals opportunity to step into neighborhoods and engage in nefarious activity. Access control is about determining how we allow people in and out of neighborhoods. What are the entrances, the exits? What does fencing look like? What are we doing around roadways and lighting and those pieces to deter criminal activity? Territorial reinforcement is really about making sure that pavement treating and art and signage and really making sure that we're defining public spaces can be a deterrence. It creates a sense of ownership for folks. And then last but not least, maintenance. I think this is the one that a lot of folks in Baltimore tend to hyper-focus on when we talk about cleaning and greening and making sure that we don't have high grass and weeds. And while this is a component of SEPTED, it is not the only component of SEPTED. Next slide. And so you're about to hear from the interagency work group that has been collectively carrying out multiple facets of the work. You can see that we've listed partners here on the screen with their action plans and their staffing capacity that's been dedicated to doing the work around the intersection of environmental design and public safety. And then we're also looking forward to engaging in a dialogue with you all and hearing your ideas about SEPTED and other ways that you think that we can deepen the work. Next slide. So here's where we're really talking about the Comprehensive Violence Prevention Plan and how it is working to address SEPTED. It is something that while we don't explicitly call out in the document itself, it is something that we were very thoughtful about. So Pillar 2 speaks to the creation of neighborhood policing plans to address resident identified challenges. And this is one way that we're being really intentional about looking for opportunities to improve public safety outcomes through that environmental design that's led in partnership with our community. Next slide. Next slide, please. Forgive me, I need to put my glasses on. I can't see that far. Great. This is a continuation of the neighborhood policing plans that are being piloted by BPD and Muncie in 2 police districts, the Western District and in the Southern District, specifically with Fayette Street Outreach and with Greater Baybrook. And we'll hear more about that from our partners at BPD in a moment. Next slide. Thank you. And so those were just a few examples of where we can see elements of SEPTED showing up in the mayor's action plan. I'm going to turn it over now to the Department of Planning to talk about the ways that their agency is touching SEPTED and the work that they do.
Thank you, Director. In addition to some of the things the Director talked about, I'd like to talk a little bit about history of SEPTED in Baltimore and what the Planning Department is doing now. Some of you may remember back in the 1990s, there was an epidemic crack in Baltimore's neighborhoods, and the Planning Department did engage a number of neighborhoods in Southwest Baltimore in a SEPTED planning process with 2 partners, primarily the Community Law Center and the Citizens Planning and Housing Administration. We also partnered with the Baltimore Police Department, but not, I think this is notable, not necessarily with the leadership of the department, but the beat officers, the post officers, I think they call them, who were very helpful and instrumental and worked very closely with the community associations to identify the business activity in the neighborhoods and come up with ways to thwart that. That said, today, we've grown the community planning division of the planning to a total of 17 planners that we are willing and able to make available to the communities of Baltimore to help devise these CPTED plans. And we've started to look into funding sources for training not just the 17 planners, but MONSE staff, HCD staff, police department, and community residents in Baltimore. So much larger scale than we have talked about in the past. We've done a couple of trial runs with that, one with HCD and MONSE staff, an in-house training, and then within the planning department itself, we've explored the sort of professional national trainings made available by the National Institute of Crime Prevention. And that's what we're seeking funding for. Once we obtain it, we probably will want to modify that training a little bit to tailor it more to Baltimore's circumstances, but we're not quite there yet. And then finally, in addition, as you may know, every 10 years after the census, we update the city comprehensive plan. We're in the midst of that now, about halfway through it. We've held several Design for Public Safety workshops as part of that effort. It's been a popular topic with the public, and commercial break, we'll be holding another citywide comp plan meeting the first Saturday in December, on December 3rd, and it will also have a CPTED component to that citywide meeting. And then our website's on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Next, we'll hear from DCHD.
Thank you, Director Jackson, and good afternoon, everyone. The Department of Housing and Community Development has been, actively partnering with MONSE and the other agencies, including the Department of Planning. We actually worked with the Department of Planning, as Director Ryer stated earlier, too, on in also partnership with the State Department of Housing and Community Development on a training for our staff, MONSE staff, planning staff, other staff members, and then we'll be continuing to advance staff training in these areas around CPTED principles, how we're all kind of working together to implement. We have partnered and put together part of the mayor's $100 million commitment on the housing side has been a $2 million allocation to CPTED in terms of piloting the CPTED work in the two pilot neighborhoods of Fayette Street Outreach and Greater Baybrook. So we are working with MONSE and those neighborhoods. We actually are, I believe the team has the meeting scheduled. We've done kind of an initial walk in Greater Baybrook. We have another walk scheduled with Mayor Scott at the beginning of December in Fayette Street Outreach. We'll be working with the community to do more planning around some of the activities, specific locations, specific items in terms of targeting pieces from the DHCD side, everything from vacant homes, vacant lots, vacant properties, vacant lots, to existing residents, to assisting, looking at kind of priorities on if we need to do any security cameras, better lighting, home repair, specific things, kind of fences, sidewalks, brush removal, tree cutback, things that sometimes to our residents that will assist, right, in crime prevention when we think about our existing residents' properties outside of either city-owned or private-owned vacant properties, and how to help support them, because we also know that not only do a lot of our families have difficulty, doing basic home repairs in terms of roof heating, et cetera, when you're also talking about trying to maybe help trim back trees or, you know, maintenance on exterior areas that can also help when we talk about crime prevention through those environmental changes and ensuring that the neighborhood, right, has kind of the cleanliness approach. Illegal dumping comes to mind as well. So we have a very wide component in terms of the number of, it covers pretty much every division in the Department of Housing and Community Development when we talk about CPTED principles. We also have staff members that have started to take the National Institute of Crime Prevention training. There are some additional classes that we've also committed funding for to send, you know, staff for specific certifications and training. And we also have state support and, you know, in partnership with the planning department in terms of looking for that additional funding, you know, to support those pilot neighborhoods as well on the community level training that needs to happen to advance the work. So we are very excited about this, about the partnerships that we have, the cross-agency partnerships that we have when we look at advancing CPTED in these two pilot neighborhoods. And then once again, it's going to also drive the question of scale and what we can do after that. But we know that we'll be learning a lot, and there's a lot that we also do in other neighborhoods that we can continue to kind of look at CPTED principles as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll hear from DOT next.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, Liam Davis, Baltimore City Department of Transportation, Legislative Affairs Manager. Thank you for providing Baltimore City Department of Transportation the opportunity to be here today to have this important discussion. When we talk about where DOT really comes into this conversation, there's a number of areas where I think we do play a vital role. What's really interesting in having these conversations with our partner agencies is how closely aligned crime prevention through environmental design seems to be aligned with our Complete Streets efforts. Prioritizing getting more feet on the street to help lower crime, when our actual Complete Streets manual puts pedestrians at the top of our prioritization list. Right now, we're really trying to reimagine and redesign the various corridors across the city that for the past 70 years had not been designed with pedestrians really in mind. And I think a number of these corridors have often been described as being soulless or devoid of soul. And I do think that that's relevant to this conversation today. Just as a general reminder, the Complete Streets Ordinance was adopted by the City Council in 2018. In 2021, the city's Department of Transportation published the manual. And again, we're prioritizing pedestrian safety ahead of single occupancy vehicles and prioritizing things like folks getting around on wheelchairs and in walkers and people who use public transit or ride bikes. But in addition to Complete Streets, we've had a number of legislative accomplishments that I think are also relevant to this conversation, ways we're partnering from a public safety standpoint with MONSE and Baltimore Police Department. I think most notably is the I-83 speed camera program. While not necessarily really focused on environmental design, I do think that roadway getting people to slow down does kind of reinforce, public safety. In addition, we did secure authorization this year in Annapolis for automated bus lane enforcement, and we're seeing more and more bus lanes being implemented across the city. Some of the feedback that we've gotten since the bus lanes have been installed is that enforcement has been lax. That's one of the reasons why we went after the automated bus lane enforcement authorization. We're currently in the planning stages of implementing that, but we're a ways away because it has to go out to bid. A huge thing for us, which I think everyone here is familiar with on the council, is reversing the cuts for the city's highway user revenue allocation. when we talk about environmental design and implementing complete streets, if you're going to do it with a long-term focus using hardscape construction as opposed to flex posts and paint, that takes money. We have thousands of miles worth of public right-of-way and hundreds of millions of dollars, actually over $1 billion in capital needs. So that requires money. Reversing the highway user revenue cut, we'll start to see, the city will start to see increased dollars coming in to reinvest in our infrastructure and actually implement complete streets. In addition, the successful adoption on the federal side of things, getting the bipartisan infrastructure bill adopted, there's a provision in there called the Reconnecting Communities Grant. A major influence of that being added into the infrastructure bill is West Baltimore Route 40, often described as being the highway to nowhere. Baltimore City Department of Transportation recently submitted a grant application to begin planning what the future of that 600-acre scar on the surface of West Baltimore, what do we do with that? How do we reconnect those communities? And I think that's absolutely tied into this conversation today. In addition to kind of the capital project side of things, which I think are very relevant to this conversation, we're also working with our partners on the operations side through special events coordination, assisting BPD with crowd control when there's major events, whether it be the fireworks downtown or major sporting events or things like Halloween in Fells Point. And then our standard traffic enforcement, parking enforcement, and towing, making sure people are adhering to the rules of the road and making sure the neighborhoods are not overly congested with cars that shouldn't be there. So I'm available if you have any questions or feedback, and thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Next, we'll hear from DPW.
Good afternoon, Yvonne Moore Jackson for DPW. And DPW Solid Waste supports this effort by providing the services that help the police officers to see what's going on in neighborhoods by cutting the grass, cleaning neighborhoods in partnership with the DHCD and the community, and also working with the community on making sure they understand how to dispose of their waste correctly. Also, we board up properties to make sure that the community is safe. And for fiscal year 2022, we closed out roughly 1,600 service requests that we prioritized that the Baltimore City Police put in, and we also answer calls and emails from them when there are emergencies, when they have to, if we have to board up or clean up some illegal dumping so that they can do what they need to do in that area. Some other things that we do are community engagement. We do the mayor's walks and things like that to make sure that we are aware of what's going on and what services we need to provide in the community. We also have a illegal dumping pilot going on that where we're proactively looking for illegal dumping in some of these hotspot areas and cleaning up just to make sure that these areas are clean and safe for residents. So I'm here if you have any questions.
Thank you, ma'am. BPD?
Good afternoon, Sarah Ritter with BPD, Office of the Deputy Commissioner Operations. So from BPD's perspective, kind of at the global scale, CPTED is really one tool within our larger community policing plan framework. And the community policing plan states, that all officers are community policing officers, and we really need to think about how all officers understand the role of the environment and how to work with community to solve some of the underlying issues that are going to lead to crime. So ways in which that shows up at a department level, certainly through training. Each year we have our community policing training that is always incorporating elements of CPTED. We have our neighborhood coordination officers, one unit in each district, and their job is really to be the subject matter experts for the whole district on how to use tools like CPTED. So we're reviewing, in all CompStat meetings, we're not only reviewing the activities of the neighborhood coordination officer team as it relates to CPTED and how they're working with community to identify these issues, but we're also looking at the district as a whole. How many 311s have the district, 311 service requests have all district members submitted through their tour of duty, you know, in foot patrol, right? Foot patrol is a metric of crime prevention through environmental design as well as business checks and community meetings. So from a department level perspective, this is kind of how we think about the ways in which CPTED is incorporated in all aspects of operations. Then specifically, as it relates to sort of a deep dive crime prevention through environmental design, our neighborhood policing plans that we're partnering with MONSI and all the agencies in the room to implement, as Director Jackson mentioned, piloting in 2 neighborhoods. From BPD's perspective, we are thinking about scale, right? That's been the word of the day in many ways. And so two ways in which we are investing from the police department's side on this. One, we received federal funding that we are allocating to both University of Baltimore to help with the evaluation components. So that includes surveys of community groups, focus groups with those communities to really understand the perception of safety in our neighborhoods, also the perception of how they're working with the police department and how some of those working relationships can be improved through the neighborhood policing plan. So some of that funding is going to University of Baltimore to support that work, as well as to LISC. They are a technical assistance provider. They have a ton of experience, their safety and justice team, as technical assistance providers on the DOJ Burn Criminal Justice and Innovation Grants, which are all about CPTED and problem-oriented policing. So we're using that money to really bolster our capacity to work with community, and LISC will be working directly with the community groups to build their capacity to participate in the CPTED process, right? What are the roles that community groups can play to really use resources effectively using this methodology, right? And sometimes, you know, CPTED is not an acronym that automatically community groups are gonna know, so something that LISC is helping us with. The other place we're investing for neighborhood policing plans is in terms of our professional staff. So thinking about the NCO teams, how can we bolster their ability to partner and pairing them with positions we're calling safety resource coordinators. This is, again, a best practice recommended by LISC. When you're thinking about how to implement things like CPTED, you need a ton of partners. And so building that bridge between the police department and all these other partners, these professional staff will work out of the Chief of Patrol's office and help to kind of build some of those bridges. Next. And then very quickly on the neighborhood policing plan status. So the way that we have organized this, again, is using a problem-oriented policing acronym, SARA, S-A-R-A, and is just sort of the general framework recommended for how you approach CPTED.
Did you choose that name?
I spell my name with a H.
You just couldn't find an H, I know.
Yeah. We'll think of what H could stand for. But I do have preference for it as a special place in my heart for this process. So in terms of how we've thought about how this plan has progressed in the 2 pilot neighborhoods, So again, the scan has really, that's been completed in the 2 pilot neighborhoods, doing surveys and focus groups with our 2 partners in Fayette Street Outreach and Brooklyn Curtis Bay. We then moved to the analyze phase. What that looked like is both doing some quantitative mapping of crime and property data, as well as doing a deeper dive with our NCO teams on okay, where are the hotspots and what is really going on there? And then how can we build a response based on that deeper understanding? I'll show you, the last slide I have will show you a little bit more detail what that looked like. We are currently in the response phase with Monzi and all the folks in this room. After we understood the problems, how are we acting on solutions, right? And so with Monzi, we're now managing those responses. And in the final phase, we are gearing up right now with our evaluation partner to understand what impact did it have. And so that impact assessment that UB will provide will also help us think about, okay, what do we need to modify, what do we need to keep as we're scaling into 2023. And then the last slide, just to give you a sense of some of the things that, from BPD's perspective, these are sort of the processes we want to scale, and some of the things that these new positions will help us do as well, working with the NCO teams. So on the bottom right, you'll see this is the dashboard tool we made. It's available publicly. It's available to all the partners involved in the project. It layers property data with crime data. So it really begins to help you see sort of where some of these CPTED issues align. And then, so that's showing it for the FSO pilot. On the top left is that deeper dive, right? So once we look at the overall area and see where some of these trends are clustering, how do we then dig in to understand, okay, what do we actually have to do to address these underlying issues? So those were created by convening the NCO teams, really having them do the first assessment, but then running it past our agency partners and our community partners to say, okay, are we all seeing the same things here before we move forward with an action plan? So again, these are kind of the building blocks that BPD is committed to creating in support of the neighborhood policing plan, and we look forward to continuing to build this out in 2023.
Thank you, ma'am. And so our last slide here, we'll take 2 minutes or less. So as we think about how Baltimore has approached CPTED in the past compared to what we're doing right now, we know that primarily DCHD and DOP have handled CPTED-related work and initiatives with Department of Planning, really making sure that CPTED's been incorporated in our city plans for the last 15 years. They have really applied principles of CPTED in Southwest Baltimore during the 90s to make sure that we were deterring drug sales and loitering. And as we shift into this interagency, this collaborative approach, you're now seeing so many more agencies come to the table with a deep understanding of the intersections between public safety and environmental design. And not just at CPTED level 1, but at levels 1, 2, and 3 to be really thoughtful about what it's gonna take for us to get to a place where we aren't having conversations about crime prevention, we're having conversations about reimagining something else. Department of Planning has, as Director Ryer mentioned, sought that training that's sponsored by the National Institute of Crime Prevention. Both he and the commissioner mentioned that. And we know that CPTED's emerging as an area of interest across Baltimore City in our neighborhoods because they're starting to understand what it actually means, that it's not just an acronym. And we know that folks knew that blighted buildings, high grass and weeds, not having security really attracts opportunities. But as we really start to think through again, those levels 2 and 3 implementations of CPTED while working on level 1 is where we want to bring communities into the mix, and the neighborhood policing plans are going to help us uncover that. The last thing that I'll say in closing is that in addition to the $650,000 that BPD has invested from an evaluation perspective in those 2 neighborhoods, Mayor Scott has invested $700,000 into this pilot on top of the $2 million that you heard Commissioner Kennedy mention specific to the CPTED related work. So there will absolutely need to be some budgetary and some scaling considerations as we prioritize subsequent neighborhoods and think through what this looks like. happy to take questions.
Thank you, Director, and thank you to each of the agencies that gave us a little bit of insight on how you have a role in implementing CPTED across the city. I have a lot of questions. I'm not going to get to all of them.
We are just very active today.
Yeah, we are very active. You got the ones today, so we're here. We're here for you.
Doing a good job.
You know, I had a couple of questions. I'll just start with two, and we'll move down. And you know, we're not going to keep you guys here all day, but we'll get to as much as we can. Just first, I appreciated one, that each of us is doing something CPTED related, which I think is super helpful. But I would love to understand how we're working together, and where exactly we're working together. I understand we're doing CPTED in 2 districts, and then I understand we're doing CPTED through HCD in 2 neighborhoods, but the efforts they don't seem to be coordinated.
They actually are, and I'm happy.
Okay.
I'm happy to explain that a bit more. While each agency that's sitting here is doing, you know, individualized work, we're also doing cross-functional work. And so when we started the neighborhood policing plan pilot in these 2 districts, with the exception of planning, initially every agency that you see here have been a part of this from the beginning. There are actually a couple of agencies that aren't here that are a part of it as well, specifically Parks and Recs and BSIT. And so we are all very much involved in this integrated proof of concept, if you will, around what it's going to take to effectively leverage crime prevention through environmental design, so that we can be talking to you all about what scale looks like next.
Good. And I think it's funny, both you and Sarah mentioned scale. Interestingly, I think for an approach like this, I think, and I'm going to steal this from the gentleman who actually came when we first introduced this, but he always described CPTED, you know, and the methodology as small is beautiful. And the idea is you start in an area where you have a lot of problems. And depending on the types of problems you have, you're going to have different approaches. So if you have property crime, your approach to property crime is going to be very different from your approach to violent crime. You know, you're going to think of target hardening, which we talked about last week. You're going to think about, you know, of course, more eyes on the street, but you know, what's going to bring those eyes out there. For violent crime, it's going to look a little bit different. You're going to be thinking about maybe cameras and stuff like that to discourage stuff like that. So, you know, the point being, I think, I'm really curious at how we are sort of looking at a smaller perspective, how we're being more focused with our limited resources in the areas that we know we need it. And then also, me being the data guy, I really appreciated all the data that we had in our last presentation. How are we measuring our success and measuring our progress on this initiative, knowing that we are putting money toward it? How do we know it's working?
So I'll take the beginning of the question, and then we'll punt to Sarah, no pun intended, because we're using the Sarah process to actually determine what success looks like. And for that reason, we don't have a lot of data to present to you right now, given where we are in the process. We have, to Sarah's point, completed that initial set of focus group conversations and what we were calling environmental scans with both neighborhoods, did multiple environmental scans, and did a series of work that was a part of that work. So happy to share the report that came out of that initial findings, if that would be helpful to this body. Obviously, stepping through the completion of the data mapping tool. We heard Sarah talk about the tool that BPD has created to kind of cross-reference pieces, and that's kind of where I'll jump back to your original point around starting small, and then I'll hand it back over to Sarah. So while we talk about these 2 particular neighborhoods, within these neighborhoods, we have asked them to specifically focus in on a couple of blocks. And so while we know the neighborhoods in their entirety have extensive crime-related issues, both from a violence and from a property perspective, we've very intentionally chosen 100 blocks of certain areas so that we are starting small within the larger context of the neighborhood. Sarah, would you add anything here?
So Colonel Jones first. So I would just say, so the jewel of the program, the neighborhood policing program, either it be Greater Baybrook or the Fayette Street outreach, is that it's individualized to that district. We've realized that. I think before the approach was the panacea of one thing fits all, and we're just going to slap this broad brush and everybody's going to get this. That's not working. Right. So the jewel of this is the active listening part between the district commanders, our partners here, the community, to say, look, when we say we have a problem, that doesn't mean just give us a cop here. It means the problem is environmental. It's trash, it's speeding, it's lights, it's crime, it's all of these things. So that's where it helps out with every individual district gets its own individual plan with active listening of how to address it. So that's how we see it going forward, because we know it's only through this problem-oriented policing that all of the issues truly get addressed, and that it's a win-win-win for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the Colonel covered most of it. I think we are, within BPD, of the hotspots identified in the neighborhood policing plans, we are every other week receiving reports on specific crime, specific proactivity in those specific areas. So from a BPD perspective, we're monitoring the trends and the activity in those areas. That is data that is ultimately going to go to our evaluation partner that I referred to. So they are planning to do an impact assessment, which will incorporate that data at the end of the year. So to your point on data, just wanted to raise that. We have data, and it will be eventually packaged in a way that we can have that conversation as well. In terms of the question of scale, and everyone's going to look different, so how in the world are we going to scale this in a way that makes sense? That is the intention of bringing on these safety resource coordinators. There will be 3 of them reporting to one overall program manager. So there'll be 1 resource coordinator per 3 districts that will work with the NCO teams. I see you doing the calculations, probably still not enough. But that is how we're thinking, right? We need to begin to tailor this geographically and build out geographic specific resources and understanding so that we can craft those plans that actually make sense for the problems presenting in those neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Sir, and this kind of goes back to, what Director Jackson said in reference to how we think as post for police officers. That's first thing I think. And when coming to this new role and roles, I would say post, you would look at me like, what does that post mean? But then I would have to break it down to, oh, Brooklyn, or this is Hanover and Patapsco, or this is those neighborhoods. So when you come to hotspots, the way to address it and the optimization of this is post, hotspots, but then there are micro segments. You can have something that's in a post, that's in a hotspot, that yes, it's the hotspot, but it's right here. So you may not need it on the southeast corner of that hotspot, but you need it on the northwest corner. That's how specific we need to be. That's what the optimization of this with these civilian professionals are going to get us to in identifying. It may not look like enough people, but we're only talking about specific micro segments of areas that we need to address.
Yeah, I think what you make me think of is how we deal with those issues today is we put a cop on that corner. And while that does help, it often does slow down or sometimes fully eliminate the problem while the cop is there. The moment that cop gets pulled off somewhere else, we'll see the violence or we'll see property crime, whatever it is. And I think the idea here is we know that there need to be permanent structural changes sometimes, whether it be cameras, whether it be lighting, whether it be how traffic flows, whether it be how fast traffic is on a block in order to encourage more people to be there legitimately and discourage folks from being there illegitimately to permanently fix the problem. And that helps the department because now a cop doesn't have to sit there for his entire shift. But that's how I'm thinking about it. And the sort of metric piece for me is like, once we make these changes, Once we address the housing issue, whether it be vacants or whether it be speeding for DOT or whatever it may be, did it work? Can we now move that cop somewhere else until we have the resources to do a plan there as well? Is sort of how I'm thinking about it. But I'm sorry, Director, you were going to say something and I went off.
I think the point that I was just going to make is that the tool that BPD has built that overlays the crime statistics with the neighborhoods, the landscapes, further gets us to the point that the Colonel was making around pinpointing specifically where we had the opportunity to employ crime prevention through environmental design so that we don't necessarily have to place a cop on that corner.
Yep. Thank you. Councilwoman.
Thank you. And I appreciate that, Director Jackson. I just want to highlight when we're talking about this design, this micro design, I want to make sure that we at least have some correlation with pending research that's happening at the University of Baltimore. Dr. Seema Iyer, excuse me, she's done a lot with like the Neighborhood Indicators Program, because even though there is kind of like specificity within the neighborhoods, and that can be accomplished by utilizing partnerships with community-based organizations, expanding their capacities there. So not only are we creating that rubric and that aspect of like performance metrics of what Chair Conway and I are talking about, we are having that specificity within the neighborhoods while building capacity of said Baltimore-based community-based organizations. And so all of that should be aligned. And I know you're thinking about it, but I just want to make sure that all of us are really utilizing that approach, because if we don't have a standardized approach, it's really going to be very hard to kind of package it all, Sarah, to what you're talking about, package it all into a report for us.
Yes, ma'am. I would say we're doing more than thinking about it. Even though Dr. Iyer is leaving Benya, we have been having conversations with her.
You see the panic. You
I
gotta
know.
explain that. Wait, what?
Now it's public. There's news about her doing some other work. So I'll leave it to you all to Google and/or check in with her LinkedIn profile and all of those pieces. Dr. Iyer and I have been having conversations for many months now, and in fact, Monty has a contract with the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, and they are due to provide us with a total landscape of analysis of Baltimore City by the end of the year.
Oh, perfect.
And so we absolutely are thinking through the integration of those community-based assets. As a part of that landscape analysis, we're also going to be getting delivered a capacity building plan for those assets that takes data that Benya already captures and overlays it with neighborhoods that we are hoping to have inform the SEPTED conversation.
That's perfect. Okay.
You all might recall that there is a reference in the mayor's comprehensive violence prevention plan about the creation of neighborhood stat.
Yes.
We haven't gotten there yet, but this is one of the
this is the
foundation
precursor.
pieces of neighborhood stat.
Okay.
And if I can just add, I think what is really important when we first started the framework for the MPPs is how do we socialize that with our officers? For them to be able to see every resource that is needed, every support system when they are out on calls and handling, calls for service, where we respond, hey, this is not really an issue for police to handle, but let me make sure that I'm making that connection. Starting over 22 years ago, we had that. We do still have something similar, but I think because we are in this technology, digital world, and we're giving every single thing and every tool in the toolbox to our officers right at their fingertips, that was one of our biggest concerns, to make sure that in every district where they are, especially when we have officers who may be transferred or they're promoted up or they're working details and they're in areas that may not be familiar to them or they may not have trained, that they can just automatically go and say, oh, all I need is this is right here, so let me direct you there. So I think that it is bigger than just saying, hey, we have this, but also one of the biggest tools that I think that'll make us more effective.
And I'm so glad that you all are thinking about this, and specifically for BPD, I keep harping on I keep harping on kind of like the redirection of staffing hours and operations and capacity to our other agencies, because, you know, most of the time when the conversation is about the BPD budget is bloated, it's not really a look at the staffing hours and operations that are associated per officer that can be reallocated through interagency agreements, memorandum of understanding with other agencies as well. So those are the types of, like, you know, kind of budgetary changes that I'm looking for in the next budget season that I know you all are thinking about, but I just want to make sure that you present it to the council in a way that we can follow the tracking of those hours. For example, NCOs down in Brooklyn, I know they are logging at least 300 hours, like point blank period, over the course of a month, just logging 311 requests. That can be, you know, reassigned to, you know, other, maybe, you know, that can be assigned to other staffing in other agencies so that it can be, you know, you can redirect your focus back to public safety. Not that that is not public safety, but a better use of the resources that you all have for public safety. And it also builds capacity within other agencies as well. Can I have one more question? Yes, sir. I wanted to make sure, Director Jackson, there are opportunities for us to build the capacity with community-based organizations. Can you speak to how we are engaging our industry-based partners, particularly BG&E, with some of their community catalysts and impact grants for our community-based organizations, so that we're kind of moving the nodule for them as well, because that's going to help out, you know, with lighting, street lighting, with, you know, a lot of these community-based organizations and neighborhood associations have, you know, committees, subcommittees, whereby this can be a project for them while building the capacity and technical assistance of said organization.
I would say that MONSE is not directly engaging corporate partners like the Baltimore Gas and Electric Company or Exelon, and would defer to partners who may be engaging on this level, and we know that we need to. Yes. We also know that in addition to corporate partners around capacity building, that we need to be partnering with the Maryland Association of Nonprofits, and we have begun that partnership, specifically having conversations with the director there around the capacity building opportunities that they have for taking advantage of the learnings that come out of this assessment that Dr. Iyer is doing. But are other agency partners able to speak to this question directly?
And if not, I would ask that it's something that we look forward in the next performance year. We have a lot of industry partners here in the city of Baltimore, and a part of their social impact. And as far as their just being in the city of Baltimore, they got to put some more skin in the game as well. So,
yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
I know you're going to bring up vacants.
Thank you. Just sticking on this capacity building point for a moment. I saw on one of the BPD slides you are having a partnership with LISC. LISC is not in Baltimore unless they're starting to come back now. What is that partnership?
So LISC is in Baltimore to the extent their public safety and justice segment. So they do have several projects through that team. They are specifically focused on public safety and its connection to community development. So it's actually run by LeVar Michaels. He's from Baltimore, lives in Baltimore. So they have national reach and have actually supported several projects in Baltimore through their role in the Byrne Criminal Justice and Innovation Grant. They're the technical assistance provider for that. So they work with community groups around the country to understand how would you implement a community development strategy that incorporates problem-oriented policing and community-based crime prevention strategies.
So they would be working with community development organizations and community associations
Correct.
to train them on
to
this?
train them. And so, for example, they're already working with our 2 pilot sites. When we have the money from MONSE for ARPA, right? How are those groups are going to use that in a way that aligns with CPTED strategies in crime prevention through environmental design? Because oftentimes for community groups, they throw a lot of ideas, but are all of them going to have a public safety impact? So LISC is working to kind of shape the strategies of those community groups and also help them build internal capacity to actually implement those strategies.
So when I hear capacity building, it's not just about knowledge and training, it is money.
Absolutely.
Many of our community development organizations, and you'll understand the background that I come from is the former executive director of the Community Development Network of Maryland, which is a network of community development nonprofits across the state. And we have a network here in the city, Brooklyn Curtis Bay being one of them. We had talked at that time the work of capacity building, particularly in areas that need capacity, is money. And the Community Catalyst grants from DHCD were actually born out of those conversations. The Community Catalyst grant is only $2 million now, Commissioner, is that right? That's about, give or take. And there are times when those Community Catalyst grants are still going to the usual suspects. Not always, but a lot of the time. And so this conversation about capacity also has to count about money, because they can't do it with the executive director and the assistant and the organizer doing a million everybody's job along with trying to organize, because organizing isn't us doing the work, right? Organizing is meeting people where they are, getting their ideas, and then making it look like it's their idea, right? And making it happen. So I want to hear a little bit more about, is there going to be specific money for Brooklyn Curtis Bay Community CDC, for the CDC I call them CDOs, Community Development Organizations, that are with Fayette Outreach? As you scale, there's going to be money for them as well?
So I'm happy to take that. I think it makes sense to differentiate the buckets of money. You're absolutely right. Capacity building is not just about technical assistance provision, but equally importantly, in some cases more importantly, about making sure that we are putting the money where our mouth is. And so while you hear Sarah specifically talking about the $650,000 to UB for evaluation and the partnership with LISC through a grant, and you hear the commissioner talking about the couple $1 million of investment for CEPTED, what I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, and will reiterate for members of the public, is that there is $700,000 for these two neighborhoods in particular that the mayor, or these two community-based organizations that the mayor has specifically allocated, and both of those community-based partners have submitted budgets for that. So a total of $700,000 across this pilot. And I've reviewed those proposals in partnership with other agencies through the lens of equity and making sure that we're asking the right questions around the assessment, excluding things that we, through a lens of equity, did not believe could have been included, and we've made those award determinations. And so both of these community-based organizations will be getting money. I think that the question again becomes, how much money do they get in subsequent years, right? Because if we've gotten to this place of the implementation of these CEPTED principles and we've gotten through the evaluation, will they need, let's say we split it down the middle, not necessarily saying that that's what's going to happen, but will they need $350,000 every year, or will this $350,000 infusion plus the $1 million per neighborhood have gotten them to a place where we're saying that they need $100,000 per neighborhood, and that's the part of the assessment of the work that we'll need to complete. But yes, the mayor has made an allocation of dollars into these neighborhoods that are separate from the evaluation and separate from the CEPTED work.
Thank you.
Councilwoman, I would just add, I mean, certainly Monzi is pulling a lot of resources into this. From the LISC perspective, they were very adamant that a portion of theirs is going to go to pass-through grants, right? So it's not going to be a ton, but like, what are those starter initiatives, starter projects, in addition to the larger amounts of funds that are going to be coming through Monzi? And so part of their scope of work is, to your exact point, capacity building involves finances, and so it's not just sort of the small amounts that they'll be able to pass through to help get started, But then also one of their things they're going to do with each of the groups is create a plan for funding, right? So what are all the different places they can look for funding? So certainly appreciate the point and just wanted to make sure that's, you knew it was also on the LISC radar when
you.
we're talking capacity.
Yeah, thank you for that clarity about LISC too. I appreciate it. Because nationally, there's this thing about LISC and enterprise and how that works, and in the community development field, it's pretty critical to know the difference.
Yeah, this is not their housing development
Right,
side. Yeah.
gotcha, yep. So my other question is, the Rec and Parks, you had mentioned they're not here, and I saw that pretty loudly. We love our trees, we want more trees. We also know that trees cover lights. So how is Rec and Parks going to be engaged in that work? Because we need to increase, canopy, but we need the trees trimmed, and we need to do it in a proactive way, not always with 1,311s. They are significantly backed up right now. It is really difficult to get stuff done because they have, talking about capacity, they have not been able to do this job. So I would like to know how they're going to be engaged in this work, and if they're going to have sort of dedicated staff for this, because the lighting is part of SEPTED. Again, we love our trees. We just can't see if they're in a dark place, it makes it difficult. Or the other way to think about it is, and something that we tried in our area, this was years ago, more pedestrian lights, right? I mean, you install the pedestrian lights rather than use the big Cobra lights, which is a DOT issue or a BGE issue, depending on the street. So talk a little bit about that.
Thank you for your question. I think the first point that I'll make is that in referencing that Parks and Recs and BSIT weren't here, it wasn't meant to say that they aren't very strong partners in the work, just that all of our partners weren't represented in the room today. So I just want to be really clear about that.
I'll say, Director, Councilwoman Ramos, when we were planning this meeting, there's probably like 12 agencies that are part of this, and so we initially just took the most essential ones. Of course, Rec and Parks is part of that large contingency, and we'd love to have them here, but I think we just want to try to stay focused, but you're absolutely right.
Thank you, sir. So Parks and Recs has actively been involved in this neighborhood policing plan pilot since the inception. I think it makes sense probably for me to defer to the agency that handles lighting, because Monty does not, to talk about the partnership that they have with Parks and Recs as it relates to tree canopies and all of those sorts of pieces. So Liam, when you are ready, sir.
So we definitely acknowledge the importance of increasing this city's tree canopy, but also making sure our corridors are well lit, and it is an active partnership with forestry from Rec and Parks. In my experience, generally forestry has been very proactive with our actual street trees. Or at least in recent years, we've seen improvement from when I first started in the city. I know there's still work to do.
Director, before you leave, I had one question for you. Director, come back!
Sorry.
Sorry about that, guy.
No, it's all right.
I have one quick question for him.
Would you like me to continue? Okay, so I'll say this. There's always room for improvement. However, I think we've seen things have gotten better in terms of forestry management of the street trees since when I first started with the city, when their budget was significantly cut during the Great Recession. So I can't really speak to everything forestry is doing, but it sounds like their new director, Daniel Coy, is working on scaling up their efforts in terms of maintaining the street trees. I do also know we've gotten some complaints related to parcels that are technically right-of-way from highways or DOT, and I think Councilwoman Ramos and Councilman Torrance are familiar with the location around Hamden. In cases that aren't really like street trees, or like they're just kind of leftover parcels of land that technically DOT is responsible for, we will work with forestry. They'll give us an invoice, and we'll actually, pay to have it done. So there is a partnership. We're still working through the specifics, and we also have our own landscape management section within DOT Maintenance Division that can do some limited vegetation management as well. I think the important thing to also realize is just the sheer scale. There's over 78,000 streetlights that the city manages in partnership with BGE. So there's a ton of lights. And it's just something we have to continue to work on improving.
Thank you. I'm glad there's some acknowledgement of that. I have another question, which I think you're already anticipating, but if you want to go with Director Raya first.
Sure. I know Director Raya, you have to leave. I just had a really quick question. You mentioned 17 planners that are at the ready for planning initiatives like this, like CPTED. How do you access those folks? Are they ready to discuss CPTED specifically, and how should we think about using that as a resource for the city?
Yeah, no, good question. So they're your community planners. I think you're all familiar with them. Not all of them are trained yet. That's the issue. So we've done a couple of in-house trainings. I think it needs more depth than what we've given them before, because the idea is to train them to work directly with community reps. And for example, National Institute for Crime Prevention, ever since 9/11, they've had this sort of militaristic language they use, which is really inappropriate for working with a community rep. So we have to kind of figure that out and train everybody up and kind of get, so we provide equal service.
Okay, that's super helpful. And that leads me to my other question. If I could slide this in there, Councilwoman, just by raise of hand, what agencies currently do training for CPTED?
Do training or have attended training?
That's a good question. I asked the questions here. So, no, I want to know how many of us incorporate it within our agencies so that there are individuals who are prepared to help implement this strategy or are thinking about it when they're out in communities. So I've got housing, planning, MONSE, BPD. So I certainly think that's an opportunity for us, and there are of course other agencies who aren't here. And I'm wondering if we're training at the right levels and at the right amount so that we can leverage those opportunities where CPTED could be helpful. But thank you. Councilwoman, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Kennedy, you mentioned here that, obviously part of the work is in vacant property abatement. Are you doing similar to what you're doing or what we together are doing in my district, which is literally going block by block saying this house is for receivership, this is for in-rem, this is for this, that, the other, and really are they the higher priorities for our strategies at this point to address this? Because honestly, and I keep saying it, it's very difficult to address crime if you've got vacant properties. Period, end of story. I'll even go further and say we cannot address crime without eliminating our vacant and abandoned properties. So that is part of the CPTED work, but just in general, where we should be coming from addressing this crisis, the vacant property crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. The team has been working not just in the kind of block focus, like the areas of specific focus that have been working on in partnership with MONSE and BPD on kind of the specific blocks that are focused, but we've actually taken it out to the entire footprints for both of these neighborhoods in terms of the analysis of what tool in the toolbox we'll be implementing to address those. We've already also had conversations with developers that are working in those neighborhoods, like building the pipeline for both receivership, in-rem, tax lien foreclosure, other, and then there's also some demolition that has to occur in those areas as well. So it's a key piece of the analysis that we're doing when we talk about specifically about, SEPTED related activities in these neighborhoods, but it's a key piece of the analysis that we're doing across the city and all of our neighborhoods related to vacants.
Yeah, thank you. I just think it's so critical, and that I hope, you had mentioned the 100 million. There's 15 million for blight elimination, which is mostly in the impact investment areas. These areas are not in the impact investment areas. So is there going to be additional dollars coming from, the mayor's office or whoever to say, we're prioritizing these two areas for SEPTED, and to have those for blight elimination, stabilization, and the developer incentives that we keep talking about? Like, this is a $3 billion problem that we keep having about our vacant properties, and so I just want to make sure we're starting to think about how we're going to raise that money. It doesn't have to be all city money. There can be private investment as well and leverage. But if we're thinking about this as a comprehensive way of addressing public safety, and this is a big priority, like, is there going to be more money for addressing those?
Yeah, I mean, we've identified specifically the 2 million, so $1 million for each neighborhood for the implementation of the strategies in those blocks.
Right, you had mentioned that earlier. I just don't think that's going to be enough. So
no, I mean, it's not going to be
Right.
enough. We know that coming out of the gate. So we have other funds that we've identified, because we also have funds that we've identified not just on the vacant property piece, but also to support the existing residents, because that is just as much
Absolutely.
as
Yep.
a part of
Home
this
repair.
as, like I said in the other statement, it's just as much as a part of SEPTED as dealing with, the vacant properties. We also have vacant lots that we have to look at. We have fencing. We have the business corridors. I mean, part of principles of SEPTED 2 go beyond that to look at how the communities are socially interacting in the space, and DHCD has a role there with the existing residents as well. So we have programs that are putting money in, not just on the vacant side, but also on the existing resident side, related to all of the myriad of different activities and business activities, social space activities, et cetera, that are needed.
Yeah, and agree that the home repair piece is critical to this strategy. So I do appreciate that. I am a huge fan, actually, of the police doing 311s. We don't always agree on it, but I think that it is important, because it is part of, you're out there already, you can see things, and I have, neighborhoods, and I think that's true in other communities that don't use 311. So they're not going to be able to take advantage of this strategy or any strategies if they're not doing the 311s, because we need the data. So I know that is something that we've talked about, and happy to help there as well. My last question was, could you remind me how the SEPTED areas were chosen? Because if we're doing all of this work in Western, why aren't we in Western in this scenario?
Fayette Street Outreach is in the Western District.
Right, but
so the neighborhoods, and Sarah can probably speak to this as well. The neighborhoods were chosen using a rubric that not only factored in 311 calls for service, crime rates, all of those sorts of pieces, but neighborhood readiness to engage based on the number of community-based organizations that were in the neighborhood, and what active participation looked like, and a host of other factors. Sarah, would you add anything there? And it was a weighted rubric.
That pretty much covered it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Director.
they didn't apply. That was just something that you looked at based on various criteria.
There was neighborhoods identifying themselves as interested in the process.
That's right,
Yeah,
okay.
and then that rubric was applied to those neighborhoods who identified themselves.
We originally started with 10, I believe, 10 neighborhoods that expressed interest in being a part of the neighborhood policing plan work through BPD's Community Policing Plan Initiative.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks for the reminder about that. I just wanted to make sure that, because we hadn't talked about SEPTED in a while, so that the public understands, and then we understand as well. I think that's it for me. Thanks.
Those are all my questions as well. Councilwoman Porter stepped out for the moment. Look, I think, once again, as we talk about the various strategies that we're juggling here, I think it's important that we are constantly talking in the open and evaluating our progress or lack thereof to understand what the next step is and can be. You know, here it seems like, you know, we have some things going on and some things yet to settle. It seems like I think we all agree that this is something that can be useful to us, and we've begun to integrate it into our processes. I would really, really love to see what our accountability mechanism looks like, what metrics look like into the future, and I think even more being very focused so that we can assess our progress or lack thereof based on you know, what we see in a given neighborhood. So with that, you know, I really appreciate all the presentations from the agencies and the you know, 3 hours you guys gave us, or more, 4 hours, excuse me, 4 hours you guys gave us, you know, to talk through these issues. With that, we're going to go into recess, and I will see you guys next month. Thank you.